Story 1. The silence was the first thing I noticed about Lake George. Not peaceful silence, but the heavy kind that feels like something is holding its breath, waiting. I'm Alan Fitzgerald, and this happened back in 2012, when I took a trip in my old RV looking for a bit of peace away from my job at the local hardware store in upstate New York. I always like to think of myself as an easygoing man, good with a wrench and better with a corny joke. If you asked me for a screwdriver, I might have handed you a Phillips head with a lime wedge on the side. My co-workers at Johnson's Hardware would roll their eyes but laugh anyway. It was Tim from plumbing who suggested I needed to get some fresh air before you drive us all nuts with those jokes. So I decided to drive my 1989 Winnebago Warrior up to Lake George, hoping to unwind. The best part of an RV trip is that your bed is right there, and you never have to worry about pricey motel rates or suspicious sheets. My Winnebago had seen better days. The olive green exterior was faded and there was a persistent drip from the kitchen sink I could never quite fix. But it was mine, paid off and reliable. The route took me around winding roads with tall pines on both sides, creating a tunnel that seemed to swallow the sunlight. I remember thinking how the trees looked almost unnaturally straight, like soldiers standing at attention. My radio kept cutting out, transitioning from classic rock to static and back again. Eventually I turned it off altogether, preferring the hum of tires on asphalt. Lake George was supposed to be calm this time of year, with fewer tourists crowding the water. When I arrived, I saw a couple of boats moored along the shore, their hulls making soft thumping sounds against the wooden docks. Beyond them, the lake shimmered like dull metal under a cloudy sky. Something about its stillness bothered me. Lakes should ripple, should move. This one looked frozen in time. I parked my RV at a quiet campground called Pine Haven. The entrance sign hung crookedly from a single chain, swinging slightly though there was no breeze. The fellow at the reception kiosk, a gaunt man with yellowish skin stretched tight over prominent cheekbones, gave me a wave and mentioned he was heading out soon. He asked if I was all right with being the only person staying there for the night. Not another soul for miles, he said, his voice raspy like he'd been smoking for decades. Cell reception's spotty too. You sure you want to stay? I shrugged and said I liked the solitude. He handed me a map with trembling fingers, pointed out the facilities, an old shower block, a fire pit area, and the path down to the lake. Don't go wandering after dark, he added, not meeting my eyes. Woods get disorienting. People get lost. I laughed, told him I'd stick close to my RV. He didn't laugh back. After he left, I felt the weight of true isolation. The campground had 10 spots for RVs or tents, all empty except mine. Picnic tables sat abandoned, their wood weathered gray. A playground with a single rusty swing creaked softly, though again there was no wind. The sound set my teeth on edge. A narrow trail led down to the lake where the breeze finally picked up, carrying a faint smell of wet leaves and something else, something metallic and sour that I couldn't place. I strolled along the water and noticed how the heavy clouds hung low, threatening rain. It felt like we were in for a storm, though the forecast had promised clear skies. I found an old wooden dock, its planks warped and split from years of exposure. I sat at the edge, letting my feet dangle above the water. A few mallard ducks floated by, quacking like they were telling jokes of their own. I watched them until they disappeared around a bend, leaving ripples that quickly faded to nothing. As the light began to fade, I saw something move beneath the surface, too large for a fish, too deliberate for a current, just a dark shape there and gone in seconds. I leaned forward, trying to see deeper into the murky water, but there was nothing. Just my imagination, I told myself, though I pulled my feet up quickly enough. That night I set up a small campfire near the RV. The wind whistled through the pines, and I tried to convince myself I felt at ease. I grilled a hot dog, sipped a soda, and pretended the quiet was comforting rather than oppressive. Every snap of a twig in the surrounding woods made me turn my head, expecting to see someone or something watching from between the trees. The fire cast strange shadows that seemed to move independently of the flames. One in particular caught my eye, a tall, thin silhouette that stretched up the trunk of a nearby pine. It looked almost human, with elongated limbs that swayed slightly. I blinked and it was just a normal shadow again. By the time I crawled into the RV to sleep, exhaustion had overtaken my unease. I locked every door, closed every curtain, and checked the bathroom twice before finally lying down. Sleep came slowly, filled with half-formed dreams of dark water and faceless figures standing among trees. I woke around midnight to a rustling sound outside. It sounded like someone rummaging through the trash bin I'd tied to a post. I peeked out the RV window expecting a raccoon, but couldn't see much in the dark. The moon was hidden behind clouds, casting the campground in deep shadow. The rustling stopped abruptly, replaced by something else, a soft rhythmic sound like breathing. It seemed to come from right outside my door. I froze, barely breathing myself, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. Then came a scraping against the side of the RV, not the scratch of branches, but deliberate like fingernails dragging slowly across metal. It moved from the back toward the door, stopping just outside. I waited, clutching my pillow for what felt like hours. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been the wind or an animal. Sleep didn't return until dawn was breaking through the trees. Morning greeted me with a cold drizzle. I stepped outside to find the trash bin tipped over and garbage strewn on the ground. In the midst of the mess, there were footprints larger than mine, pressed deep into the mud. At first, I shrugged it off, thinking maybe a bigger animal had wandered through. But something about those footprints struck me as human, yet oddly shaped with toes too long and splayed in unnatural directions. I cleaned up quickly, trying to ignore the way the mud seemed to cling to my hands, reluctant to be washed away. The shower block had only cold water that came out rust-colored for the first minute. As I stood under the feeble spray, I could have sworn I heard someone else breathing in the stall next to mine, though I'd seen no other vehicles at the campground. The day passed without much trouble. I picked up groceries at a convenience store a few miles away. The clerk, a wiry man with tired eyes and a nervous tick in his left cheek, hinted I should keep an eye on my belongings. Folks around Lake George had been complaining about theft. "Things go missing," he said, glancing out the window at my RV. "People too, sometimes." I thanked him and made a joke about my wallet being too thin to attract any thieves. He didn't laugh, just stared at me with those tired eyes that suddenly seemed much older than his face. "You staying at Pine Haven?" he asked as I turned to leave. I nodded. "Watch the water," he said. "Don't go in after dark." I wanted to ask him what he meant, but something in his expression stopped me. I simply nodded again and left, the bell above the door jangling with false cheerfulness. On the drive back to the campground, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following me, though the road behind was empty. Once I pulled over to check a map, and in the rearview mirror, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods. When I turned around, there was nothing there. Back at the campground, the air felt different, charged somehow, like before a thunderstorm. I noticed fresh tire tracks in the mud leading to a spot 2 sites down from mine. Someone else had arrived while I was gone. As I parked, I saw them, a young couple unloading gear from their sleek modern RV. They looked so normal, so out of place in the eerie quiet of Pine Haven that I almost laughed with relief. Little did I know, their arrival would mark the beginning of true horror. Back at the campground, I met the young couple, Derek and Sandra, who had just pulled in with their own RV. They were friendly enough, offered me a beer, and asked about local fishing spots. Derek was tall and athletic, with an easy smile that never quite reached his eyes. Sandra had long auburn hair and a nervous habit of touching the silver locket around her neck whenever conversation lulled. "Been here long?" Derek asked, popping the tab on his beer with a sharp crack that echoed across the empty campground. "Just since yesterday," I said, accepting the cold Kenny offered. "Place is pretty quiet." "Too quiet," Sandra murmured, glancing at the surrounding trees. "Gives me the creeps." We talked for a while, trading travel tales as the afternoon faded toward evening. They were from Buffalo, on a weekend getaway to celebrate their 3rd anniversary. Derek worked in insurance, Sandra taught 2nd grade. Normal people with normal lives who had somehow wandered into this place that felt increasingly abnormal. I was glad to have neighbors. Solitude is great, but having someone to chat with once in a while can be a relief, especially when the wind makes those strange howling sounds through the pines and the lake water looks more like oil than water under the cloudy sky. As we talked, I noticed Sandra kept looking over my shoulder, her eyes narrowing slightly before returning to our conversation. The 3rd time it happened, I turned to see what had caught her attention. There was nothing there, just the edge of the woods where the underbrush grew thick and tangled. "Something wrong?" I asked. She shook her head, touching her locket again. "Thought I saw someone watching us. Just shadows, I guess." Derek laughed, a bit too loudly. "Your imagination's working overtime, babe. We're the only ones here." But he glanced in the same direction, and I didn't miss how his hand tightened around his beer can until the aluminum crumpled slightly. As dusk settled, I decided to check out that same wooden dock again, figuring I might catch a glimpse of the sunset if the clouds broke. Derek and Sandra said they'd join me. The 3 of us walked down the trail, joking about how Lake George had more trees than people. But our laughter sounded hollow, swallowed by the dense forest around us. The air felt cooler near the water, heavy with moisture and that same strange smell. Wet leaves and something metallic underneath. A hush blanketed the water. No birds calling, no insects buzzing, just our footsteps on the path, and the occasional splash of water against the shore. The dock creaked under our weight as we walked to the end. The boards felt softer than they had the day before, as if the wood was rotting beneath our feet. The lake stretched before us, still and dark, reflecting the gray sky. No boats were visible now. We could have been the last people on Earth. Then I spotted something floating in the shallows, maybe 20 yards from the dock. At first I thought it was driftwood, a pale log bobbing gently, but as we got closer, peering through the gathering gloom, we realized it was a body, a man's body, face up in the water. "Oh my God," Sandra whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. We stared, frozen in horror, as the body drifted closer, pushed by a current we couldn't see. His eyes were open and there was no mistaking what had happened. His clothes were drenched and dark stains were visible around his abdomen. There was a jagged wound across his chest, not clean like a knife wound, but torn, as if something had ripped into him with terrible force. His face was the worst part, pale and bloated from the water, but contorted in an expression of pure terror. Whatever had happened to him, he had seen it coming. His mouth was open in a silent scream, and there were marks around his neck like bruises, but shaped wrong, more like suction marks than fingerprints. Sandra let out a gasp, and Derek looked like he might be sick. My hands began to shake. That smell of wet leaves turned into something metallic and bitter, the unmistakable copper scent of blood. "We need to call someone," Derek said, his voice cracking. "Police, ambulance." But we all knew it was far too late for an ambulance. As we turned to hurry back to the campground, I glanced once more at the body. In that instant I could have sworn his head turned slightly, those dead eyes fixing directly on mine. A trick of the current, I told myself. Nothing more. We scrambled back to the campground to call the authorities, but the phone lines in the reception kiosk were dead. A constant buzzing on the line that sounded disturbingly like whispering voices. None of us had reliable cell reception out here, our phones showing either no signal or a single bar that disappeared as soon as we tried to dial. Derek tried to climb a small hill to get a signal, disappearing into the trees while Sandra and I waited at the camp's entrance, listening to the wind in the trees. Every shadow felt like it might hide someone watching us, every rustle in the underbrush a potential threat. "This place," Sandra said quietly, hugging herself against the evening chill. "Something's wrong with it." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The feeling had been growing since I arrived, that sense of wrongness, of something lurking just beyond what I could see. "Derek said he heard something last night," she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper though we were alone, "scratching at our RV. He thought it was branches, but—" She touched her locket again, a nervous gesture I was beginning to recognize. "When we checked this morning, there were marks in the metal, deep gouges." I thought of the scraping sound outside my own RV, the overturned trash, those strange footprints. "Did you see anything?" She shook her head. "But I feel it watching all the time." She turned to look at me, her eyes wide with genuine fear. "Have you felt it too?" Before I could answer, Derek came crashing back through the underbrush, breathing hard. "Got through," he panted. 911. They're sending someone." We retreated to the safety of my RV to wait, none of us wanting to be alone. The interior felt cramped with 3 people, but I was grateful for their presence. Outside, the wind had picked up, howling around the corners of the vehicle, occasionally hitting a pitch that sounded uncomfortably like a human wail. I made coffee, the familiar ritual helping to steady my nerves. As we sat around the small table, Derek suddenly asked, "Did either of you notice anything strange about that body?" Sandra flinched. "You mean besides the fact that it was a dead body floating in the lake?" "The wounds," Derek said, his voice low. "They weren't normal." I knew what he meant. That jagged tear across the chest had been too wide, too violent for a knife, and those marks around the neck, circular, almost like something with suckers, I said, the thought emerging before I could stop it. "Like octopus tentacles, but bigger." Sandra stared at me, her face pale. "That's impossible." "Of course it is," I agreed quickly. "Probably just decomposition or fish got to him." But we all fell silent, thinking about what might be in that lake, what might have left those marks. Hours passed with no sign of the police. Night fell completely, darkness pressing against the windows of the RV. The only light came from my small propane lamp, casting our faces in harsh relief and throwing grotesque shadows on the walls. Around 10 we heard the crunch of gravel. Headlights flickered between the pines. sweeping across the campground as a vehicle approached. Relieved, we rushed out, expecting to see the promised help had finally arrived. But the vehicle that rolled into view wasn't a police car. It was a rusted pickup, its front bumper held on with wire, its once red paint faded to the color of dried blood. It came to a stop a few yards away, the engine ticking as it cooled. A tall man stepped out. He had broad shoulders, frayed jeans, and a shaved head with a long scar down one side of his face, puckered and red as if it had never properly healed. He carried himself with a slouch like he had all the time in the world, moving with a predator's casual confidence. "You folks call the police?" he asked, his voice steady and unnerving, too calm for a man standing in a dark, empty campground. We nodded, explaining what we found at the dock. As I spoke, I noticed his eyes flat and emotionless, like a shark's. They never blinked, never showed a flicker of surprise or concern at our story of a mutilated body. "That so?" he said, and narrowed those dead eyes. Then he took a pistol from behind his back and leveled it at Derek's chest. Sandra screamed. My throat went dry, and Derek raised his hand slowly, his face draining of color. "Now," the man said, that same terrible calm in his voice, "let's have a talk about what you really saw." The man told us to get on our knees, one hand still on that gun. The gravel bit into my kneecaps as I complied, mind racing, searching desperately for a way out. The campground was isolated. No one would hear us if we shouted for help. No one would come looking for us for days. I tried to keep my voice steady, asking him what he wanted. He smirked, said something about how we'd seen too much, and that we were messing with his business. That body in the lake must have been someone he'd crossed or someone who owed him. I realized we were dealing with a killer who thought we were witnesses. "We didn't see anything," Sandra pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "We don't even know who that was." "Shut up," the man snapped, his calm facade cracking slightly. In that moment, I saw something worse than anger in his eyes. I saw fear. He was scared of something, and that made him unpredictable. "On your feet," he ordered, gesturing with the gun. "We're going for a walk." I glanced at Derek. He looked terrified, his athletic frame seeming to have shrunk in on itself. Sandra's face was pale, tears running down her cheeks. I tried to crack a joke about how we had no idea what we'd seen, a desperate attempt to defuse the situation, but my voice quivered and it came out all wrong. The man told me to shut up. Then he forced us to walk toward the edge of the campground near a thick cluster of trees. He was marching us deeper into the forest, away from the RVs, away from the road, away from any chance of rescue. The night had grown darker, clouds completely obscuring the moon and stars. The only light came from the man's flashlight, a weak yellow beam that barely penetrated the gloom. The trees seemed to close in around us, branches reaching like gnarled hands. The wind had died, leaving an unnatural stillness. My heart pounded so loud that I could hardly hear anything else. Through the dark, I could make out shapes, a tangle of branches, the slope of the ground, and a faint glint of water through the trees. We were heading back toward the lake, I realized with growing dread. I swallowed hard, thinking I might never leave that campground alive. Images flashed through my mind, my small apartment back home, the hardware store where I worked, familiar faces of friends and family. Would anyone miss me? How long before they found our bodies? The man kept us moving, occasionally prodding Derek's back with the barrel of his gun when he thought we were walking too slowly. The trees thinned as we approached the shoreline, and I could see the dark expanse of Lake George stretching before us. The water looked like liquid obsidian, reflecting nothing. "Stop here," the man commanded when we reached a small clearing near the water's edge. We turned to face him, our backs to the lake. In the dim light, his face looked inhuman, all harsh angles and shadows that scar a livid slash across his skin. He kept the gun trained on us, but his eyes kept darting to the water behind us as if expecting something to emerge. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice lower now, almost conversational. "This lake has always been hungry. I feed it so it leaves the rest of us alone." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the night air. He was talking nonsense, but the fear in his eyes was real. "What are you talking about?" Derek demanded, finding his courage at last. The man's face contorted with anger. "You saw it," he hissed. "The marks. You know what lives in there." "We don't know anything," I insisted. "We just found a body, that's all." "Liar," he shouted, the gun shaking in his hand. "You saw the marks, the hunger marks. It's been taking more lately, getting bolder." His voice dropped to a whisper, growing. Behind us I heard a splash, something disturbing the still surface of the lake. The man's eyes widened, focusing on a point beyond our shoulders. His hand trembled more violently. "It's coming," he breathed. "It knows you're here." In that moment of distraction, Derek saw his chance. He lunged forward, shoving the man's arm upward. The gun discharged with a deafening crack. The bullet harmlessly lost among the trees. Derek and the man grappled, fighting for control of the weapon. "Run!" Derek shouted at us. Sandra stood frozen, but I grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the path back to the campground. We had only taken a few steps when another shot rang out. We turned to see Derek stagger backward, a dark stain spreading across his chest. He fell to his knees, looked down at the wound with an expression of disbelief, then collapsed face first onto the ground. "Derek!" Sandra screamed, trying to run to him. I held her back as the man turned the gun toward us. "No one leaves," he said, advancing slowly. "No one leaves the lake once it chooses them." I pushed Sandra behind me, my mind blank with terror. The man was only yards away now, the gun pointed at my chest. I braced for the impact, the pain, the darkness. Then something impossible happened. The surface of the lake erupted behind the man. Water sprayed in all directions as something massive broke through, something that glistened wetly in the faint light, something with writhing serpentine limbs. The man spun around, firing wildly at the thing emerging from the water. His screams pierced the night as one of those limbs, thick as a tree trunk and covered in pulsing suckers, wrapped around his waist and lifted him off the ground. I couldn't process what I was seeing. My brain refused to accept the reality of the monstrous shape that towered over us, water cascading from its bulk. More limbs rose from the lake, undulating in the air like grotesque dancers. The man's screams cut off abruptly as he was pulled toward a gaping maw that opened within the central mass of the thing, a mouth ringed with razor-sharp teeth that gleamed ivory in the darkness. "Run," I whispered to Sandra, unable to take my eyes off the horror before us. "Run now." This time she moved, turning to flee back up the path. I followed, not daring to look back as the wet sounds of feeding reached our ears. We ran blindly through the woods, branches whipping our faces, roots threatening to trip us with every step. Behind us, the sounds from the lake grew fainter, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following, slithering between the trees with terrible purpose. We burst into the campground, gasping for breath. Without discussion, we headed for my RV. It was closer. My hands shook so badly I could hardly get the key into the lock. Once inside, I slammed the door and locked it for all the good that would do against what we had seen. Sandra collapsed onto the small bench seat, her face blank with shock. "Derek," she murmured. "Oh God, Derek." I couldn't find words to comfort her. What could I possibly say? Her husband was dead, killed by a madman who fed people to a monster in Lake George. It sounded insane, impossible, yet we had both seen it with our own eyes. I moved to the windows, pulling all the curtains shut, then checked that every door and vent was secured. It felt futile, but I needed to do something, anything, to create an illusion of safety. "What was that thing?" Sandra asked, her voice barely audible. I shook my head. I don't know. The image of those writhing limbs, that terrible mouth, was burned into my mind. Nothing in nature, nothing in science could explain what we had witnessed. We sat in silence, straining to hear any sound from outside. The wind had picked up again, rushing through the pines with a mournful howl. Occasionally something would brush against the side of the RV. A branch, I told myself. Just a branch. "We need to get out of here," I said finally. "Now, tonight." Sandra nodded, her eyes hollow with grief and fear. "My keys," she whispered. "They're in our RV." The thought of venturing back outside, of walking the 20 yards to their vehicle, filled me with dread. But staying here waiting for that thing to find us was unthinkable. "I'll go," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "You stay here. Keep the door locked." She grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in painfully. "Don't leave me alone." I hesitated, then nodded. Together then, quick and quiet.
We prepared ourselves, gathering our courage, rehearsing our plan, straight to her RV, grab the keys, then drive away from this nightmare as fast as possible. Simple, survivable.
I found a flashlight and a large kitchen knife, pathetic weapons against what lurked in the lake, but better than nothing. Sandra's face was set in determined lines, her initial shock hardening into a kind of desperate resolve. We moved to the door, ready to make our run for it. That's when we heard the crunch of gravel outside, the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching the RV. We froze, hardly daring to breathe. The footsteps came closer, slow and deliberate, circling the RV once, twice. The metal siding creaked as something pressed against it, something heavy. A shadow passed by the window, distorted through the curtain but unmistakably human-shaped. Then came a knock at the door, 3 precise raps that seemed to echo in the small space. "Hello?" Called a voice deep, authoritative, normal. State police. Anyone in there? I exchanged a glance with Sandra, relief warred with suspicion. Had the local police finally arrived, or was this another trick? Show some ID, I called back, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a pause, then the sound of something being pressed against the window, a badge illuminated by a flashlight from outside. It looked official, but I still hesitated, remembering the man who had claimed to be responding to our call. Sir, ma'am, I need you to open up, the voice continued. We received a 911 call about a body. Is everyone all right in there? Sandra nodded at me, her eyes pleading. We needed help, needed to report what had happened to Derek. With a deep breath, I unlocked the door and opened it a crack.
A state trooper stood there, tall and solid in his gray uniform, hat pulled low over his eyes. His badge caught the light from inside the RV, looking genuine. I opened the door wider, relief flooding through me.
Thank God you're here, I started to say. The words died in my throat as the trooper looked up, revealing his face. It was gaunt, the skin pulled too tight over the bones, like a skull with only the thinnest covering. His eyes were wrong, flat black pools with no whites, no irises, just emptiness. I tried to slam the door, but he was faster, shoving it open with inhuman strength. The impact sent me sprawling backward into the RV. Sandra screamed as the thing that wasn't a trooper stepped inside, ducking to fit through the doorway. We received your call, it said, its voice still perfectly normal, a terrible contrast to its monstrous face. We're here to help. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the kitchen knife I had dropped. The false trooper looked at it and made a sound that might have been laughter. That won't help you, it said. Nothing will. Its uniform was soaking wet. I realized, water pooling around its boots on the floor of the RV. A lake smell emanated from it, algae and rotten, deeper, older things. What do you want? Sandra demanded, her voice shaking but defiant. The thing tilted its head at an unnatural angle. The lake is hungry, it said simply, and you have seen too much. It moved with shocking speed, lunging toward Sandra. I reacted on instinct, throwing myself between them, knife outstretched. The blade sank into its chest with surprising ease, as if its flesh was soft and yielding as mud, but no blood flowed from the wound. Instead, lake water gushed out, dark and foul-smelling. The false trooper didn't flinch, didn't even acknowledge the injury. It simply grabbed my wrist, its hand cold and slick as a fish, and twisted until the bones cracked. I cried out in pain, dropping the knife. Sandra grabbed a heavy flashlight from the counter and swung it at the creature's head. It connected with a wet thud, but again the thing showed no reaction. It batted her aside with its free hand, sending her crashing into the RV's small kitchen area. With my uninjured hand, I groped blindly for anything I could use as a weapon. My fingers closed around a can of cooking spray I had left on the table. In desperation, I aimed it at the creature's face and pressed the nozzle, blasting its eyes with the aerosol. To my surprise, it recoiled, making a hissing sound of pain. Its grip on my wrist loosened enough for me to pull free. I lunged for the stove, turning on the burner. As the false trooper advanced again, I sprayed the cooking oil through the flame, creating a makeshift flamethrower. Fire erupted, catching on the creature's wet uniform. It shrieked, a sound no human throat could make, high and piercing like metal being torn. Flames spread quickly across its body, and where they touched, the flesh seemed to boil and dissolve, revealing glimpses of something beneath that wasn't bone or muscle but writhing worm-like strands. The car keys, I shouted to Sandra over the creature's unearthly screams. Get them now. She nodded, slipping past the burning figure and out the door of the RV. I kept the flame on it, backing toward the exit myself. The creature thrashed, its human disguise melting away under the heat, revealing more of its true nature, a colony of something pretending to be a man. The fire was spreading to the interior of the RV, now catching on the curtains, the upholstery. I had seconds before the whole vehicle would be engulfed. With one last blast of flame at the creature, I turned and bolted through the door, slamming it shut behind me. Outside, the night air was cold after the heat of the fire. Sandra was already returning from their RV, keys clutched in her hand. Behind me, the windows of my Winnebago glowed orange as the fire grew. Come on, she called, running toward their vehicle. I followed, casting frantic glances over my shoulder. The door of my burning RV remained closed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature wasn't finished. Nothing that unnatural would die so easily. We reached their RV, a sleek modern model that seemed obscenely normal amid the horror we had experienced. Sandra fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking badly. I kept watch, scanning the darkness between the trees, the shadows cast by the growing fire. "Got it," she said as the door unlocked. We climbed inside and she immediately moved to the driver's seat, jamming the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, headlights cutting through the gloom. Sandra threw the vehicle into reverse, beginning to turn it around to face the exit. That's when we saw them figures emerging from the woods, from the direction of the lake. Dozens of them moving with the same odd, shambling gait as the false trooper. In the headlights I could see their faces, all wrong, all wearing the same empty black eyes. "Go," I shouted. "Just go." Sandra hit the gas, the RV lurching forward, narrowly missing one of the approaching figures. We sped down the campground road toward the exit, the headlights illuminating more shapes among the trees. Some wore the uniforms of park rangers, others looked like tourists or campers. All moved with the same terrible purpose. All came from the lake. The RV bounced violently as Sandra took the rough road too fast, throwing me against the passenger door. Through the window I could see my burning Winnebago, now fully engulfed in flames. Something burst from the door, a blackened, twisted shape that bore no resemblance to humanity. It spotted our fleeing vehicle and let out another of those piercing shrieks, a sound that was answered by every figure in the woods. We hit the main road, tires squealing as Sandra turned toward town. The RV picked up speed on the paved surface, putting distance between us and the horrors at Pine Haven Campground. But as I looked back through the rear window, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. The lake itself seemed to be rising. A massive swell of dark water surging up the shore, spreading between the trees. Within that flood, things moved, elongated shapes that writhed and twisted, reaching with tentacled limbs for the fleeing humans that served the lake. The water overtook some of the slower figures, engulfing them. They didn't struggle, didn't try to escape. They simply melted back into the flood, becoming one with it again. "Don't look back," Sandra said, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Just don't look back." We drove in silence for miles, both too traumatized to speak. The road twisted through the dark forest, taking us farther from Lake George with every mile. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the lake wasn't confined to its shores, that its influence stretched far beyond, that perhaps nowhere was truly safe. Eventually we reached a small town, lights, people, normalcy. Sandra pulled into the parking lot of a police station, then sat motionless, staring straight ahead. "They won't believe us," she said flatly. "No one will." I knew she was right. We had no proof, no evidence. Derek's body was back there, likely already claimed by the lake. My RV was burned, destroying any physical evidence of the creature. We had nothing but our story. A story so incredible, so impossible that even I was beginning to doubt my own memories. "We have to try," I said, "for Derek." She nodded slowly, her face set in grim determination. We stepped out of the RV into the cool night air, walking toward the station entrance. My broken wrist throbbed with pain, a constant reminder that what we had experienced was real. As we reached the door, Sandra paused, looking back in the direction we had come. "It's still out there," she whispered. "Whatever it is, still hungry." I couldn't argue. The lake had been feeding for who knows how long, growing stronger with each victim. The man with the gun, the one who claimed to feed it, how many others like him had there been through the years? How many sacrifices to keep the horror contained? We pushed through the door into the bright fluorescent light of the station, about to tell a story no one would believe. Eventually the local police arrived, lights flashing against the tall pines. The station was small, just a few officers on the night shift. They took us into separate rooms, questioning us for hours, trying to make sense of our fragmented stories. I told them everything. The body in the lake, the man with the gun, Derek's death. But I couldn't bring myself to describe the thing that came from the water, the false trooper with black eyes, the army of not quite human figures emerging from the woods. So I lied, saying the man had an accomplice who set fire to my RV, that we had escaped in the confusion. They were skeptical, of course. A detective with tired eyes and coffee-stained teeth asked the same questions repeatedly, looking for inconsistencies. Where exactly was this campground? Who was the man with the gun? Why would he target random campers? Was this drug-related? He asked for the third time. "We can help you if you're honest with us." I shook my head, sticking to my story. When they brought Sandra and me together again, I could see in her eyes that she had told a similar version, close enough to the truth to be believable, far enough from it to avoid being dismissed as lunatics. They sent officers to Pine Haven, promising to investigate. I didn't tell them that it might already be too late, that the lake might have already reclaimed what was its own, erasing all evidence of our nightmare. The paramedics arrived next, treating my broken wrist and the various cuts and bruises we had sustained. Sandra sat silently as they examined her, her eyes fixed on some distant point. I knew she was seeing Derek fall again, reliving that moment over and over. Dawn was creeping over the small town when the police came back. Their faces were grim, confused. They had found Pine Haven campground burned to the ground. My RV a charred husk, trees scorched for yards around. But they had found no body, no evidence of Derek or the man with the gun. The lake had been calm, they reported, showing no signs of disturbance. "Are you sure this is where it happened?" the detective asked, doubt heavy in his voice. We nodded, too exhausted to argue. What could we say? That the lake had swallowed the evidence? That the creatures serving it had cleaned up any trace of what had occurred? They kept us for another day, taking formal statements, photographing our injuries. Sandra called Derek's parents, breaking the news in halting words that couldn't possibly convey the horror of what had happened. I sat beside her, offering what little support I could. When they finally let us go, we stood outside the police station, uncertain what to do next. Sandra's RV had been impounded as evidence, though they promised to release it once their investigation was complete. Not that either of us wanted to see it again, with its memories of escape and loss. "What now?" she asked, her voice hollow. I had no answer. How do you return to normal life after what we had seen? How do you explain to friends, to family, to coworkers that everything they believe about the world is wrong? That there are ancient, hungry things lurking in dark waters, wearing human skin when it suits them? We checked into a motel on the edge of town, as far from any body of water as we could get. 2 rooms, side by side, with a connecting door we left open by unspoken agreement. Neither of us wanted to be alone with our thoughts. That night I dreamed of the lake of black water rising, flowing through streets and homes, seeking, always seeking. I woke gasping, sheets soaked with sweat that smelled faintly of algae. In the connecting doorway, Sandra stood watching me, her own face pale with interrupted sleep. "You smell it too, don't you?" she asked. "The lake. It's in us now." I nodded, unable to deny it. Something had changed in us, marked us. We had seen the truth behind the world's thin veneer, and we could never unsee it. Days passed in a haze of police interviews, funeral arrangements for Derek, and sleepless nights. The authorities eventually ruled his death a homicide by person or persons unknown. They theorized that the man with the gun was a local criminal who had disposed of a victim in the lake, then targeted us when we discovered the body. The fire, they concluded, was set to destroy evidence. A neat, logical explanation that required no lake monsters, no impossible creatures with black eyes, no ancient hunger lurking in dark waters. I almost envied them their ignorance. Sandra returned to Buffalo for Derek's funeral. I offered to go with her, but she declined. "I need to do this alone," she said. "Find a way to explain the unexplainable to people who will never understand." We exchanged phone numbers, promising to stay in touch. What bound us now was beyond friendship, a shared trauma, a shared knowledge that would forever separate us from the rest of humanity. I returned home to my small apartment, to my job at the hardware store. Coworkers asked about my cast, my sunken eyes, the new gray in my hair. I told them I'd had an accident on my trip, that my RV had been destroyed in a fire. Simple, believable lies. Tim from plumbing joked that I should have stayed put instead of seeking adventure. I tried to laugh, but it came out wrong, hollow and forced. I didn't make jokes anymore. Couldn't find humor in a world where lakes could hunger and dead things could walk. Nights were the worst. Sleep came reluctantly and left at the slightest noise, the drip of a faucet, the splash of rain against windows, water sounds, lake sounds. I developed a habit of checking behind shower curtains, under beds, in closets, anywhere something might hide. I avoided baths, taking only brief showers, never closing my eyes while water ran over my skin. Sandra called weekly at first, her voice a lifeline to sanity. We spoke in code about what happened at the lake, careful never to say too much, aware that others might be listening. Over time, the calls became less frequent. She was trying to move on, to build a life without Derek, without the knowledge that haunted us both. I understood. We were reminders to each other, constantly reopening wounds that might otherwise scab over, if never truly heal. Months passed. I moved to a new apartment in a different town, farther inland, away from any significant bodies of water. I found a new job, made new acquaintances. I was careful to never call friends. Getting close to people meant questions, meant the risk of revealing too much. I kept track of news from Lake George, searching online for any reports of missing persons, unexplained deaths, strange sightings. There were more than you'd expect for a tourist destination: swimmers who vanished without trace, boats found drifting and empty, occasionally a body washed ashore with unexplained injuries. Pine Haven Campground was never rebuilt. The official story was that an electrical fire had destroyed it, and the owners had decided not to reopen. The land remained vacant, returning to wilderness. No one seemed eager to develop property so close to that particular shore of the lake. One night, almost a year after our escape, my phone rang. Sandra's number flashed on the screen. It was 2 a.m., and we hadn't spoken in months. My hand trembled as I answered. "Alan." Her voice was tight with controlled panic. "Are you awake?" "I am now," I said, already getting out of bed, switching on lights. "What's wrong?" "I was dreaming about the lake," she said, "like I have every night since then. But this time was different. This time it wasn't just a dream." I waited, dreading what would come next. "I woke up," she continued, "and my sheets were wet. Not with sweat, Alan. With lake water. It smelled like it, tasted like it." My throat went dry. "It could just be—" "No," she cut me off. "There's more." I went to the bathroom to wash my face, trying to shake it off. And when I looked in the mirror, her voice broke. "My eyes, Alan. For just a second they were black, all black, like theirs." Cold fear gripped me. "Where are you now?" "At home," she said. "But I don't think I'm alone anymore. I can feel it watching me, from inside." "Listen to me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Pack a bag, get in your car, drive to the nearest airport and get on the first flight to anywhere. Somewhere dry, somewhere inland. Arizona, Nevada, doesn't matter. Just go." "You think distance will help?" She laughed, a brittle sound. "It's in me, Alan. It found a way in." "We don't know that," I insisted. "It could just be trauma. PTSD. We've both been through hell." Maybe she conceded, but I could hear the doubt in her voice. "I'll try. I'll call you when I land, wherever I end up." "Good," I said. "And Sandra? Stay away from water. Any water. Even a glass." After we hung up, I sat awake until dawn, lights blazing, checking my own eyes in the mirror every few minutes. They remained normal, but I couldn't shake the fear that something was waiting just behind them, watching through my own vision, patient and ancient and hungry. Sandra never called again. I tried her number repeatedly over the following days, but it went straight to voicemail. After a week, I contacted the police in her hometown, asking them to check on her. They reported back that her apartment was empty, with no signs of struggle or foul play. Her car was gone from its usual spot. It appeared she had simply left. I told myself she had followed my advice, fled to somewhere dry and distant, started a new life under a new name, cutting all ties to her past, including me. It was easier to believe that than the alternative, that the lake had reclaimed what it considered its own. Years have passed since then. I've moved several times, always farther inland, always to drier climates. I live now in a small town in New Mexico, where the nearest natural body of water is miles away, and annual rainfall is measured in single digits of inches. I still dream of the lake, of black water rising, seeking, hungry. I still check behind shower curtains, still keep lights burning through the night. I've learned to live with the fear, to function despite it. Sometimes I think I see them, people with eyes that seem too flat, too empty. People who smell faintly of algae and stand too still, watching me from across streets or stores. But they never approach, never confirm my suspicions. Perhaps they're just normal humans who happen to trigger my paranoia. Or perhaps the lake is patient, content to watch and wait. I keep track of unusual deaths near lakes, rivers, oceans, patterns that most people would never notice. Drownings where bodies are found with animal attacks or unexplained injuries. Missing persons cases where the last known location was near water. There are more than you'd think, more than could be coincidence. I've never returned to Lake George, never set foot in the state of New York again, but I know the lake isn't confined to its shores. Whatever ancient hunger dwells there has tendrils that reach far and wide, wherever water flows. I still picture Derek lying there in the darkness, and I remember the weight of that branch in my hands as I struck the man with the gun. I'll keep those memories locked away, but they follow me even now whenever I close my eyes. If you're reading this, consider it a warning. Lakes are not always what they seem. Water is not always just water, and if you find yourself near a shore where the surface is too still, where no birds sing and the air smells of wet leaves and something metallic underneath, run. Run and don't look back. Because the lake is hungry, and it never forgets those who have seen its true nature. It's something I'll never joke about. Story 20. My name is Terrence Boyd. And this happened to me back in 2009 near White Sands, New Mexico, while I was traveling alone in my old RV. I bought this RV for cheap, mostly because I liked the idea of cruising at my own pace and sleeping wherever I parked. I grew up in a small town in Oklahoma where folks called me Terry and teased me for being a dreamer who rarely finished a job on time. But I found ways to laugh at myself, and people got used to the idea that I had big dreams even if I never looked like the type. I'd saved enough money to take a month off, and I figured I'd roll through the American Southwest, see the bright sand dunes, then move on to the next desert wonder. On the day it all started, the sun beat down on my RV's windshield. I squinted behind my cheap sunglasses, trying to make sense of the two-lane highway. The air conditioner had stopped working miles ago, so I had every window cracked, letting warm air wash over me. It was a relief when I saw a sign for a public camping area a few miles ahead. I pulled in just after lunch, parked on a flat stretch of gravel, and hopped out to stretch my legs. I spent an hour wandering around the dunes. The sand felt so fine under my sneakers that I kicked off my shoes for a bit just to feel it between my toes. As I roamed, I spotted another traveler, a wiry guy named Arnie, decked out in a loud Hawaiian shirt. He was in his early 30s like me, had a ridiculous handlebar mustache, and told me he'd been backpacking across the country for half a year. We talked for a while, joked about how we were both professional drifters, and then parted ways. He was heading toward a small ridge with a vantage point, hoping to catch the sunset. I returned to my RV, made myself a sandwich, and thought about the evening ahead. Soon the wind started picking up, tossing fine grains of sand against the RV's sides. The sky took on a pale yellow hue that made everything feel washed out. That's when I noticed a green pickup truck parked way off at the edge of the campground. I hadn't seen it before. Through my window, I watched someone get out and look in my direction. I waved, trying to be friendly, but the figure just turned away and walked around the truck. By sunset, the wind had calmed. A brilliant pink and orange glow covered the dunes, and I stepped outside to watch the last light fade. I spotted Arnie again in the distance, climbing down from the ridge, and I raised a hand to greet him. He waved back, but then jerked his head toward that same green pickup, which sat in a crooked angle behind a large mesquite bush. I shrugged, feeling a pang of curiosity, yet I didn't think much of it. Maybe it belonged to someone who liked privacy. Night fell quickly and the temperature plunged. I huddled inside the RV, reading an old paperback under my dim ceiling lamp. My eyes started to drift shut when I heard the faint sound of footsteps scraping in the sand outside. I turned off the light. My heart gave a jump, even though I told myself it could just be Arnie or another camper passing by. Through the side window, I saw a silhouette move across the dunes. They circled behind my RV, paused, then continued on. I was about to open the door when a scream shattered the stillness. It was sudden, raw, and cut off too fast. I froze. My hands shook and I fumbled for my phone. There was no signal. I tried to tell myself it might have been an animal, but it sounded human. I flipped off the overhead lamp, stepped outside quietly, and peered around the corner. The full moon lit the dunes with a pale glow, and I thought I saw movement near the green pickup. For a second I considered driving off, but I worried someone might be hurt. I edged forward, my sneakers crunching the sand. That's when I saw the shape of a body slumped against a rock. It was Arnie's bright shirt, impossible to miss. I remember a cold jolt coursing through me at the sight of his arm twisted at a bad angle. He wasn't moving. My breath caught in my throat. Then from behind the pickup, a tall man in dusty jeans appeared. He wore no shirt, and he was covered in tattoos that snaked across his chest and down his left arm. He was wiping a blade on his pant leg. I stood there, too stunned to speak or move. He must have seen me out of the corner of his eye because he darted behind the truck. I heard the sound of metal scraping. Without hesitating, I scrambled back toward my RV, adrenaline sending me stumbling over patches of sand. I slipped but managed to catch myself. When I glanced back, I saw him sprinting toward me with a tire iron in one hand and that blade in the other. I yanked open my RV door and dove inside, slamming it shut. My keys were in my pocket, so I fumbled to get them into the ignition. The engine coughed once, then roared to life. Before I could shift into drive, the window beside me exploded. He'd smashed it with the tire iron. Glass shards flew across the driver's seat and stung my arm. I yelled and jerked the steering wheel. The RV lurched forward, but he tried to grab hold. His arm reached through the busted window, swiping at my face with the blade. I ducked and stomped the gas pedal. The heavy vehicle churned through the sand, surging onto the dirt road that led out. I heard him shout something, though I couldn't make out the words. My side mirror clipped a small cactus, jarring the entire frame. He lost his grip on the window and fell away. I didn't look back again. I just kept driving until I reached the main highway. My heart pounded so hard that I worried I might pass out. Once I was a few miles down the road, I slowed, gasping for air. I forced myself to think clearly. Arnie was dead. I'd seen the body, seen the blood staining that ridiculous Hawaiian shirt. I had to find help. My phone still showed no signal. That was no surprise out in the desert, so I kept driving until I spotted a gas station sign flickering in the distance. At the gas station, I pulled in and stumbled out of the RV. The teenage clerk inside looked startled by the sight of me covered in sweat and bits of glass. He let me use the landline, and I called the local sheriff's office. I tried to keep my voice steady as I explained what had happened. Within 20 minutes, 2 deputies arrived. I tried to describe the man's tattoos, his height, and the green pickup. They asked me to lead them back to the spot, so we formed a small caravan, my battered RV, and their cruiser winding along the dusty highway. When we returned to the dunes, the green truck was gone. So was Arnie's body. I felt a sick twist in my stomach at the empty ground. My footprints and tire tracks were still visible, but there was no sign of the man. The deputies searched the area with flashlights. One of them found a dark patch of blood soaked into the sand near a rock. They marked the spot for evidence, but there was no telling where the killer had fled. The senior deputy said they'd look for a truck matching my description, and they took my statement back at their tiny substation. After giving a formal account, I parked the RV behind the station for the night. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Arnie's face. I also heard that terrible scream echoing over and over. The next morning, I patched the broken window with some cardboard the deputies offered me. They suggested I stay around town, but I didn't have the stomach for it. All I wanted was to get out of there and let them handle the investigation. Before I left, one of the deputies pulled me aside. He said they'd found shoe prints matching the suspects near the bloodstain, plus some empty bullet casings by a dune. None of it pointed to a clear motive, and no one had recognized the truck from my description. I thanked them and hit the road, heading east, hoping to find some sense of peace. But the entire drive, I kept thinking about how easily that man had snuffed out a life, and how close I'd come to being next. I never heard if they caught him. Part of me wonders if he slipped across the border or drove deeper into the desert until he spotted another solitary traveler. I don't know. All I do know is that Arnie's big grin haunts me. He was just a cheerful drifter crossing paths with a stranger, and now he's gone. I tried to joke around a bit more in my travels after that, telling myself humor was how I coped, but something changed in me. I started double-checking every lock. I lost my taste for quiet campgrounds and began staying in busier RV parks with bright streetlights. It's funny how a single moment can shift your view of the world from wide-eyed wonder to guarded caution. Maybe I'm still a dreamer at heart, but these days, I don't take my safety for granted. That's about all I can say. Sometimes I catch myself replaying that night, thinking of what I could have done differently. In the end, I did everything I could just to stay alive. I hope the deputies got a lead, but I guess I'll never know. I just keep rolling down the highway trying to outrun the memory of that green pickup under the desert moon. Story 3. My name is Jake Hilbert, and this happened back in 2003 in White Sands National Park in New Mexico, while I was on a solo RV trip, eager to see those white gypsum dunes I'd heard so much about. I remember pulling into the park's nearly empty campground late in the afternoon. The sun hit the sand just right, turning everything a pale shade of pink, which was more beautiful than I'd expected. I parked my rickety RV, an old Class C that groaned whenever it hit a bump, and hopped out with my camera in hand. I like to think of myself as a sort of easygoing traveler, always ready with a joke, never one to get scared too easily. Truth is, I've got a bit of a scattered past. I used to manage a bowling alley in Indiana, then I decided I needed a change, and started driving around the country. White Sands was supposed to be a peaceful stop, a quick place to snap photos and do a short hike before heading on to Arizona. It all began simply enough. I strolled out onto the dunes, feeling the fine powder slip between my toes. A gentle breeze drifted past, and the evening air carried a faint smell of desert creosote and hot sand. I felt more relaxed than I had in months, maybe even years. My stomach rumbled, so I headed back to the campground to cook some canned chili. I remember whistling a tune from a kid's TV show I used to watch while I lit the small stove in the RV's cramped kitchen. Nothing felt out of place, no alarm bells in my head. The next morning I decided to take my time exploring. There weren't many others around, just a couple parked in a newer RV on the far side of the lot, and an older man with a tent near some scraggly bushes. He waved at me and I waved back, figuring maybe I'd talk to him later. I hiked into the dunes, snapping pictures and making silly jokes to myself about how I'd post them to my non-existent travel blog. The day was hot, but the bright sand reflected so much light it almost felt like being in a snowfield. Around noon I turned back toward the campground for lunch. That's when I noticed something odd. The older man with the tent had left. His site looked ransacked. The tent still stood partially collapsed, like it had been stomped on or slashed. My stomach churned, but I told myself maybe he'd had trouble packing up. Yet I spotted a streak of dark red against the side of the tent. Could have been spilled ketchup, I thought. Could have been anything. I told myself not to jump to conclusions, but I felt uneasy, real uneasy. I saw footprints in the white sand leading away from the tent toward a low dune that curved behind the campground. They looked like they might belong to two people. I glanced around for the couple in the big RV. Their vehicle was still there, but I didn't see them outside. The air felt heavy, and I started to sweat even though the heat wasn't any worse than earlier. I tried to call out, "Anyone there? Everything okay?" My voice echoed. No answer came back. I wandered closer to the battered tent, half expecting someone to pop out and say, "It's cool, we're fine." Nobody did. I took a careful peek inside. It was a mess. Clothes, gear, and what looked like a wallet scattered all over. The name on the driver's license read Henry Lopez. The wallet had no cash left. A lump caught in my throat. Something was wrong. I stepped away, trying to decide if I should call the authorities. My cell service was spotty, but I figured I could drive out toward the main highway to get a signal. Then I heard a faint noise, like a short cry cut off too soon. It came from behind that low dune. I clutched my camera bag for no good reason and walked toward the sound, my footsteps sinking in the fine gypsum. My heart was pounding, and I forced myself to take slow, steady breaths. I tried to think of a joke, any silly thought to calm myself. Nothing came. Behind the dune, I found the couple's footprints. I recognized the woman's pink sneakers from earlier. Next to her prints were deeper impressions, maybe a man's boots. Each stride looked wide and hurried. I followed the tracks around the curve of the dune. That's when I saw the RV couple. The man lay face down in the sand, arms splayed. The woman knelt beside him, hands pressed to his neck. She glanced up at me, her eyes wild with panic. Her face was streaked with tears. Behind her stood another figure, a tall, wiry guy wearing a faded green jacket and old jeans. His hair was shaved close, and he had a crooked scar along his left cheek. In his right hand he held a knife, a long, ugly blade that glinted in the desert sun. My chest tightened. I wanted to say something, do something. The man with the scar turned his gaze on me, eyes narrowed, like he was sizing me up. The woman tried to help her partner stand, but he wasn't moving. She pleaded, "Please help us." Her voice shook. The scarred man kicked sand at her and smirked. I noticed a patch of dried blood on his jacket sleeve. I forced words out. "Hey, let's just calm down, okay? We can talk." My voice sounded shaky, but I tried to keep it steady. The man with the knife took a step forward. I swallowed, raised my palms in what I hoped was a peaceful gesture, and felt my heart hammering. My mind raced. Why was he doing this? He didn't look like a desperate drifter. He looked more like someone who'd done this before and didn't mind doing it again. He spoke in a low monotone. "Back off. This don't concern you." I saw his knuckles tighten around the handle of the blade. The woman was sobbing softly, pressing her hand to the man on the ground whose eyes were shut. The sand under him had turned a deep red. I realized he was no longer breathing. I glanced around hoping to see another camper, a ranger, anybody, nobody, just dunes and glaring sunlight. My mouth felt dry, my knees unsteady. I was never some tough hero, never served in the military or anything like that. I ran a bowling alley for crying out loud, but I couldn't just leave that woman there. I tried again. "Look, I can get you money if you want. I have an RV. We've got supplies." I trailed off, not sure if anything I said would matter. He just shook his head and snarled, "Shut it. Drop your bag." The sound of his voice was flat, almost dead. My hands trembled as I lowered my camera bag to the ground. It felt surreal, like I was watching from outside my body. The woman made a sudden move trying to stand and run. The scarred man reacted in a flash, swinging the blade. She fell with a gasp. I froze, my stomach lurching. She clutched at her side, rolling onto her back, eyes filled with shock and pain. I shouted, "No." My voice cracked. Before I knew what I was doing, I scooped up a fistful of sand and hurled it at him. He staggered back, coughing. The grit flew into his eyes. I lunged toward the woman, grabbed her arm. She winced, but managed to stand with my help. Together we stumbled away, leaving the lifeless form of her partner in the sand. My hands felt clammy, my breath ragged. The killer wiped at his face, cursing under his breath, and then started to chase after us. We ran in a panic. The dunes felt endless, each step sinking deep, making it impossible to move fast. The white sand glared so bright it hurt to look at. I could hear him behind us, his footsteps crunching, coming closer. My heart hammered so loudly it drowned out every other sound. We crested a dune and slid down the other side. That's when I spotted a narrow service road cutting across the desert. I shouted, "There," hoping we could follow it back to a ranger station or a main road. I half-carried the injured woman who was bleeding but still conscious. The scarred man was only steps behind. My lungs burned and every muscle felt like it might collapse. Then I saw something off to the side, a small maintenance shed or utility building, weather-beaten with a locked chain around the door.
Desperate, I led her behind it. We crouched low, pressing our backs against the peeling wooden boards. She gripped my arm. Her breath came in sobbing gasps. A few seconds later, I heard the crunch of boots. He was searching for us, muttering curses to himself. We stayed silent, knees drawn up, hearts pounding so loud I was sure he could hear. I clutched a rock in my hand, the only weapon I had. Time stretched on. His footsteps circled away. I heard him growl a final curse, then the crunch of his boots fading. We didn't dare move for what felt like ages. Eventually, I peeked around the corner. There was no sign of him. Dazed and exhausted, we hobbled back to the campground, sticking close to the edges of the dunes so we could scan for him. When we reached my RV, I helped her inside. She collapsed onto the passenger seat, her shirt soaked in blood. My fingers shook as I turned the key, praying the engine would start on the first try. It coughed to life, and I drove out of White Sands faster than I'd ever driven that old rig, rattling down the main road toward the highway. We found a state trooper patrol near the entrance. I banged on the trooper's window, barely able to speak. The woman slumped in the seat behind me, eyes fluttering. The trooper called for paramedics right away, and within minutes an ambulance arrived. I tried to explain, but the words came out broken, my voice thick with horror. They rushed the woman off. I never even learned her name. Afterward, the trooper asked me to show him where everything happened. We went back in his cruiser, but by then the scarred man was gone. The older man with the tent was found dead near his campsite. The couple's partner was gone too. The desert sun glared down on those dunes, silent and unchanging, as if none of this had even happened. They questioned me for hours, took my statement, thanked me for trying to help. In the end, I drove away from White Sands, my RV rattling through the desert roads. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, not even when I finally pulled into a cheap motel that evening. I still see that man's lifeless eyes in my head sometimes, replaying the moment he advanced with that knife, and I remember feeling so helpless, so unprepared for real violence. I never found out if they caught him. I never went back to ask. I doubt I ever will.
Story 4. My name is Sam Braxton, and this all happened to me back in 2011 when I drove my old RV down to the Okefenokee Swamp in southern Georgia on a whim. I was 32, fresh off a frustrating office job I'd quit in Atlanta, and I wanted a taste of freedom. The idea of trailing along empty roads with no real plan felt like a big adventure. I grew up in a small town in Alabama, so I'd always been drawn to marshes and slow-moving rivers. They felt like home, but with a bit more mystery. My RV was a battered Class C model, the kind most folks wouldn't glance at twice. I loved it like a second skin. It gave me a place to sleep, a sense of constant motion, and a chance to figure out what I wanted from life. When I got to the edge of the swamp, the mid-August heat draped everything in haze. The cypress trees stood tall with hanging moss that looked like draping curtains, and the water underneath shimmered with patches of reeds. Even though it felt humid and buggy, I felt right. I parked my RV off a dirt path near a rickety dock I'd read about online. I planned to fish a bit, maybe snap a few photos for my folks, then keep rolling. It was quiet mostly. A few distant splashes hinted at gators or fish. Somewhere in the background, cicadas hummed. On my second day, I met a local guy named Ted. He was fishing off the same dock, hooking live worms and complaining about the biting flies. He asked if I was camping there alone, and when I told him I was in the RV just up the shore, he chuckled and said I should watch for gators. I joked I'd just park on higher ground. We chatted about catfish, old trucks, and the best roads for traveling south. He seemed nice enough, so we agreed to meet again around dusk to share a few beers. That evening I found Ted by the dock. I popped open 2 cans of cheap lager, and we talked about how we both disliked office jobs and early morning alarms. He told me he had an ex-wife in the next county, a teenage boy who wouldn't speak to him, and a father in hospice. It was raw, but he didn't seem ashamed. I felt sorry for him. The sun sank into the swamp, painting the sky a burnt orange. We parted ways with a handshake, and I headed back to my RV. My plan was simple: get a decent night's sleep, wake up early, and keep driving. Later that night, something knocked on the side of my RV. Not an animal tapping or a random tree branch. It was 3 distinct raps. I sat up in my bunk. My heart thudded, but I managed to swallow my nerves. Grabbing a flashlight, I opened the door a crack. No one stood there. I flicked the beam around, caught only the dark silhouette of cypress trunks and moss. I settled back down, but couldn't fully relax. In the morning, I found no footprints or signs of anyone, just that sticky, swampy stillness. I decided to trust my gut and find a safer area. I started the RV, but halfway down the muddy road, I had to pull over. A battered pickup blocked the path. It was an older model with a caved-in side door. No one was inside, but I saw something that made my throat tighten. A smear of what looked like blood on the driver's seat. Not a speck or a drop, a streak. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was from a cut on someone's leg. Maybe it wasn't blood at all. I got out to see if there was any driver in distress. That's when I heard a muffled cry somewhere behind the trees. I walked around calling out. The cry went silent. The quiet felt heavier than before. My foot caught on a tree root, and I nearly tumbled into a soggy ditch. Then I caught a glimpse of something pale in the dirt. It was an arm, stiff and discolored, attached to a body, face down in the reeds. I stood there, trying not to gag. When I inched closer, I saw that the person's throat had been cut. I stumbled back, shaking. This was real. I backed away slowly, trying not to make noise. I hustled back to my RV, ready to call the police. My phone had zero reception. I fiddled with it, cursed, and remembered the last gas station was at least 7 miles away. I had no choice but to move the truck myself so I could drive off. When I got to the pickup, a figure stepped out from behind it. He was tall and wiry with a sun-beaten face and watery gray eyes. He had an old camouflage jacket tied around his waist and a short machete hanging from his belt. "You lost?" he asked, voice quiet. His eyes flicked to my RV, then back to me. I tried to stay calm, just passing through. "I need to get around your truck." He sized me up. His gaze settled on the small fishing knife I had sheathed at my hip. "You don't look like law enforcement," he said. "I'm not." My voice wavered, which annoyed me. "I need to get out of here." "There's," he stepped forward, cutting me off. I saw a red stain on his shirt. It looked too fresh to be anything but blood. "You didn't see anything," he said. "If you want to walk away, forget you saw anything." My instincts screamed that he was responsible for the body by the ditch. I tried to look calm, like I was willing to pretend. I nodded and told him I'd keep my mouth shut. I even forced a half smile. It must not have been convincing because he jerked his head toward the swamp. "Throw the knife in the water," he said, pointing. "Now." I tried to obey, but my hand shook so hard I dropped it in the mud first. Then I tossed it into the dark water. "Now move the truck," he ordered. "Then you drive away and never come back." My stomach churned. I stepped toward his truck, slid into the driver's seat, and tried to crank the ignition. It was an older stick shift, so I took a moment to get it going. I managed to roll it aside, clearing the path for my RV. He watched every movement. Then, before I climbed out, I spotted something in the passenger seat, another machete caked with dark stains. My hands felt clammy. As I stepped out, he stood a few feet away, machete in hand. I waited for his next move. He pointed down the road. "Get in your RV. Go." I slipped past him, never turning my back. My mind was locked on that body I'd seen, and I worried there might be more. I wondered if Ted was safe, or if Ted was still around at all. The second I made it into the driver's seat, I floored the gas. My RV groaned and bounced over the ruts, but I didn't slow. The road bent around thick trees, and each turn felt like it might reveal him again standing there. The sweat trickled down my neck, my heart pounding. I needed to warn someone, get help, or at least find a phone signal. I nearly crashed the RV when I spotted another body on the side of the dirt track. This one a woman. Her shirt was ripped and I caught sight of a deep slash in her side. The sight made my stomach lurch. I kept going though because I was sure if I stopped I'd end up like her. Then the road opened onto a small paved lane. A sign read "Public Access Next Left." Relief flooded me at the promise of something resembling civilization. I swerved onto the paved road, ignoring the screech of my tires. After about a half mile I found a worn payphone outside an abandoned general store. Miraculously, it had a dial tone. My hands shook so badly I fumbled the coins. I managed to call 911. My voice sounded panicked and hoarse, but the dispatcher got the gist. Multiple bodies, an armed man, and I was in serious trouble. I waited there, half expecting the man to burst out of the woods. My adrenaline spiked at every rustle of leaves. Eventually, a local county sheriff's cruiser pulled up. 2 deputies jumped out. I explained what happened, stammering about the corpse in the reeds, the pickup blocking the road, and the attacker's machete. They told me to lock myself in the cruiser while they called for backup. Within an hour, more law enforcement arrived. They brought an ambulance, though there was no one to save out there. I watched as they sped back down that dirt path, sirens wailing. At some point, a deputy with a mustache and tired eyes took my statement. I asked if they'd found anyone else alive. He said no. The man with the machete had vanished into the swamp. They found 3 bodies, including the one I'd stumbled over. They also found Ted near the dock. He hadn't made it. The deputies took me to a station. I gave them every detail I could recall. My clothes were smeared with mud, and I looked worse than I'd felt in a long while. I spent hours going over the timeline, explaining how I had no clue what was going on until I'd seen that first body. By dawn, they let me go. I stepped out into the gray light, feeling heavier than I ever had. I cranked my RV and pulled onto the highway. My eyes stung from exhaustion and my chest felt tight. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ted's grin, the man's machete, and those lifeless bodies in the swamp. I wondered how I'd ever sleep again.
But I drove on, telling myself I was fortunate to have escaped at all. That gave me enough to keep going, mile after mile, until the road felt a little kinder. I never heard if they caught him. That's the part that still twists my stomach. I try to move forward, taking each day as it comes. But every so often I wake up in a sweat, remembering the knock on my RV in the dead of night. The swamp taught me a lesson I'll never forget. Some places hold horrors you can't see until it's too late. And sometimes all you can do is drive away with your life intact.
Story 5. My name is Bill Henderson, and this happened back in 2012 in Cape May, New Jersey, when I was on a solo road trip in my second-hand RV. I'd spent most of my adult life teaching history at a small high school in Ohio, and I never considered myself the adventurous type. But I'd saved up enough to buy an old RV, took a sabbatical, and decided to roam wherever the highway led. I liked the idea of being the scruffy teacher who'd one day share wild travel stories with students. People called it my early midlife crisis. I called it my history on wheels experience. When I pulled into Cape May, I was entranced by the antique look of the houses and the salt-tinged breeze coming off the Atlantic. I parked at a modest RV campground near the bay, convinced I'd spend 2 relaxed days wandering beaches and snapping photos of Victorian architecture. Soon after I set up camp, I met Irene, a retiree traveling in a newer rig than mine. She was chatty, offered me a lemonade, and joked that my RV looked like a tin can on wheels. I told her I preferred vintage rolling palace. She howled with laughter and said she liked my style. Irene told me about the local seafood places and insisted I grab fried clams at a shack near the marina. I planned to check it out the next day. That evening I went for a stroll through the beachside neighborhood. The air carried a hint of seaweed and salt, and I passed a few fishermen cleaning their day's catch near the pier. The horizon was all soft pinks and oranges under a setting sun. Everything felt calm. I'd noticed a handful of other travelers at the campground, but most of them kept to themselves. So I headed back to the RV, expecting a peaceful night's rest. Around midnight, I heard a sound outside. It wasn't loud, more like a faint rattling against the metal of my RV. My first thought was raccoons or stray cats. Still, I flicked on a flashlight and peered through the window. I didn't see anything. I dismissed it as paranoia. I'd never fully gotten used to sleeping in new places, and the whistling wind off the bay might have amplified harmless noises. I woke up early the next morning, determined to try those fried clams Irene had recommended. Before leaving, I noticed her RV door was wide open, which seemed odd because Irene had told me she always locked up. I stepped closer, called her name, and got no response. I knocked on the side of her RV. The interior looked ransacked. Cabinets yanked open, personal items scattered across the floor. My stomach tightened. No sign of Irene and no note. I considered calling the police right away, but I thought maybe she stepped out in a hurry or had some small emergency. Still, it felt wrong, so I told the campground manager, Gary, that something was off. He seemed unimpressed, shrugged, and said maybe she took a day trip. Gary was tall, about my age, with a cap pulled low over his forehead. He gave off an unfriendly vibe, but he promised he'd keep an eye on things. The day went by in a haze. I ate those fried clams, delicious by the way, but my mind kept drifting back to Irene's empty RV. At dusk, I wandered over to the campground picnic area, hoping to see if Irene had turned up. Instead, I found another camper, a college kid named Rob, pacing around. He told me his friend Dalton had vanished after going for a walk that afternoon. Rob didn't know which direction he went, and he was too shaken to make sense of anything. 2 missing people in the span of a single day made my heart pound. I tried to calm Rob, but the panic in his eyes made me uneasy. Back at my RV, the air felt heavy, and I started double-checking my locks. Then I heard a muffled cry in the distance, too brief to pinpoint. I stepped out into the dark. The campground was dimly lit by a few lanterns, but nothing appeared out of place. I had this urge to walk the perimeter and see if anyone needed help, but an uneasy feeling told me to stay put. I placed a quick call to the local sheriff's office, but I didn't get much beyond the standard "we'll look into it" response. That night, I barely slept. Morning came with a salty breeze that tasted almost bitter. I forced myself to check around Irene's RV again, still empty and still in total disarray. As I backed away, Gary rounded the corner. He said, "You snooping around, buddy? Shouldn't you mind your own?" Something about his tone struck me as menacing, but I tried to stay polite, pointing out that 2 people had vanished. He replied, "People come and go around here all the time. Doesn't mean something bad happened." His dismissive attitude rattled me. I tried to shrug it off, but a nagging voice in my head told me something was very wrong. Just then, Rob appeared pale-faced, insisting we help search for Dalton. Gary offered no assistance, just a stony glare. I volunteered to help Rob. We scoured the stretch of beach near the campground, scanning for footprints in damp sand, checking gullies for any sign of Dalton. We found nothing. A few hours later, we expanded our search to the wooded area behind the campground. The damp mulch squished under our shoes. Rob and I split up calling Dalton's name, pushing through tangled undergrowth. The further I ventured, the more anxious I got. Eventually, I came upon a small clearing. The sun filtered through the branches, showing me something on the ground, a battered backpack. Inside, I found a wallet with Dalton's ID. My heartbeat quickened. About 15 feet away, partially hidden by a fallen log, lay a body. It was Dalton. He wasn't moving. I forced myself closer and realized he had no pulse. His shirt was soaked with blood. I felt bile rise in my throat. I yelled for Rob, who came running. He took one look, dropped to his knees in shock. We managed to call the sheriff, our hands shaking so badly we could barely hit the right buttons on the phone. Before they arrived, though, Gary appeared out of nowhere. He held a hunting knife at his side, too casual for comfort. My instincts screamed that I was in danger. When I tried to step back, Gary lunged forward and grabbed Rob by the arm. The knife glinted in the sunlight. I froze, my mind going blank. Gary hissed about campers snooping where they don't belong. He threatened me, said I should have stayed in my tin can on wheels, and that if we just left things alone it wouldn't have come to this. Rob struggled to break free, eyes wide with fear. Gary slashed at his chest, and Rob collapsed in a heap. I shouted for Gary to stop, but he wouldn't listen. It was like he'd become someone else, or maybe he'd always been this way. I had no real weapons, just a small flashlight on my belt. In a scramble, I flung myself at Gary, desperate to save Rob. The impact knocked Gary sideways, but he was stronger than me, grappling until I slipped free. Rob was still on the ground, barely conscious, blood seeping onto the forest floor. Gary turned to me, knife raised. I remember the swirl of panic in my mind. Get out, survive, help Rob, do something. In a burst of adrenaline, I kicked at Gary's leg, sending him off balance. He stumbled backward, lost his footing, and hit the ground hard. I dashed to Rob, grabbed his arm, and dragged him away from Gary's reach. Gary sprang back up, face twisted in rage, knife aimed for another strike. I swung the flashlight at him with every bit of strength I had, catching him across the temple. He collapsed. I dropped to my knees, heart hammering, trying to press down on Rob's wound to staunch the bleeding. The minutes crawled by until I heard sirens in the distance. They arrived and took control of the scene. Gary was cuffed and hauled away, still unconscious. One of the paramedics pried me off Rob to work on him. I lost track of time. The aftermath is still hard for me to process. Irene was found in a shallow ditch on the opposite side of the campground, along with 2 other victims from previous weeks. The police said Gary was a drifter who'd gotten hired under false documents. No one had suspected him. They suspect he'd been targeting lone campers, picking them off when the chance arose. Rob survived. We traded phone numbers before he was taken to the hospital, and we still text each other now and then. Whenever we talk about that day, we fall silent for a moment, remembering the fear. He always thanks me for saving his life, though I feel I only did what anyone would. I find myself staring at the ocean differently these days, even when I'm miles away from it. That sense of calm I used to get near the coast has been replaced by a wary tension. But I keep traveling in my RV. I'm not sure I'll ever park in total solitude again, though. Not after Cape May. I still teach history, and I still crack jokes whenever I'm nervous, but deep down I know nothing feels the same. Story 6. My name is Michael Lansing, and this all went down back in 2011 near Saguaro National Park in Arizona while I was driving around in my creaky old RV. I'm a teacher from Missouri, used to rowdy teenagers and bad cafeteria pizza, so I figured I could handle the open road with no problem. My RV isn't exactly fresh off the lot. It's a battered machine that swallowed half my savings in repairs. Still, I've got a quirky fondness for that rumbling beast. It smells faintly of burnt coffee, rattles something fierce whenever I climb a hill. But it's mine, and I've never felt more freedom than behind its steering wheel. I parked at a small dusty campground just off a winding desert road. It had a broken sign half covered with sand, and a row of weather-beaten cacti towering like lonely sentinels around the perimeter. The moment I stepped outside, hot wind slapped my face. I wiped sweat from my forehead, chuckled at the idea that I'd left a comfortable apartment to boil under an unforgiving sun, and decided a quick walk might help me stretch my legs. The campground had only 2 other RVs. One belonged to an older couple with a big pink flamingo statue perched outside their door. The other looked abandoned, or at least nobody seemed to be around. I spent a good chunk of the afternoon fiddling with my generator. While I struggled with a jammed valve, I heard a voice behind me. I turned and saw this skinny man wearing dusty jeans and a black tank top. He had a rough face, stubble that almost glowed red under the sun, and eyes that seemed to dart everywhere at once. "Engine trouble?" he asked, crouching beside me. He introduced himself as Colt, no last name, and offered to help with the generator. Something about his shaky voice made me edgy, but I needed the assistance, so I shrugged and let him tighten a few bolts and reconnect some wires. When the generator finally sputtered to life, Colt grinned. "You alone out here?" he asked. I told him I was on a solo trip, just me and my rickety home on wheels. He bobbed his head, dusted off his jeans, and muttered something about heading back to his own site. I watched him walk toward that seemingly abandoned RV. He disappeared inside, leaving the door ajar. I figured maybe he was a wanderer like me, chasing solitude in the desert. I spent the evening swatting flies and cooking a canned chili dinner on my portable stovetop. The scorching day gave way to a mild, dry night. Stars scattered overhead like bright pinpricks. I sat on a folding chair outside, sipping a cheap beer, humming half-remembered songs from my high school days. Then I heard distant voices, one high-pitched, another Colt's low tone. The older couple must have been chatting with him. It sounded friendly enough, at least I assumed so. A couple of hours later, I was drifting off inside my RV when I heard a scream. It wasn't loud. It cut off almost as soon as it started, like someone had clamped a hand over a mouth. My heart knocked against my ribs. In the dark, everything felt magnified. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. Nothing but the faint outlines of cacti and the flicker of distant headlights on the highway. I couldn't see anyone. I told myself it might have been the old man stubbing his toe or something. That's what I tried to believe. The next morning, the bright sun didn't erase the uneasy feeling in my stomach. I walked over to the older couple's RV. Their pink flamingo statue was toppled sideways, and something about the place looked off. There was no sign of them. The door was wide open and the interior was a wreck. Tables overturned, clothes strewn everywhere. I called out but got no response. My pulse began thudding. I peeked around the door. A foul smell hit me like rotting trash. I remember stepping inside, my steps echoing on the battered linoleum floor. I turned a corner and I almost keeled over. The old man lay on his back, eyes fixed in a horrible stare, a deep slash across his chest. There was blood soaked into the carpet. His wife wasn't there, but the stains told a violent story. I stumbled out, hand clamped over my mouth. My mind raced, and I wanted to call the police, but my phone had zero signal that far out. I rushed back to my RV, started it, ready to drive for help. The engine coughed and died. I tried again. Same thing. That jammed valve from before must have gone haywire again. I tried the generator. It churned once and sputtered out. Panic welled inside me. Then I noticed footprints in the sand around my tires, like someone had been messing with the RV during the night. Out of nowhere, Colt emerged. He walked calmly, like he was out for a quiet stroll, except there was a streak of dried blood on his arm. I froze behind the steering wheel. He came close, pressed his face to the open window and smiled. I don't think I'll ever forget the strange glint in his eyes when he said, "Something's wrong." He wasn't asking, he knew. There was a wild look in his pupils like a man teetering on the edge. I tried to act casual. I just need to head into town, I said. My voice shook despite my attempts to sound calm. Colt leaned on the window frame. His tone stayed friendly, but there was an undercurrent that made me want to jump out of my skin. He shrugged. "I can fix your engine again." Then he made this slight motion like he was reaching behind his back. I saw a flash of metal, the tip of a long knife partly hidden under his waistband. My mouth went dry. All I could think was, this guy hurt that couple. He probably killed the old man. Maybe the wife too. Where was she? I climbed out of the RV, hands raised, trying to look as unthreatening as possible. "Let's see if we can figure out the engine," I mumbled. He just watched me, squinting against the sun while I popped the hood. He set to work messing with hoses. I kept glancing at the knife's handle. It poked out from his belt, and I prayed he wouldn't notice how badly my hands trembled. After a few minutes of forced silence, Colt said, "You found them, huh?" I almost dropped the wrench I was holding. I didn't answer. He took that as confirmation. "I didn't mean for that to happen," he murmured, not meeting my eyes. Then he gave a little laugh, but they wouldn't share their supplies. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the heat. I realized I was standing next to a killer, a man who probably snapped over something as trivial as water or gas in this harsh desert. His eyes flicked up. "Have you got extra fuel?" he asked. A muscle in his jaw twitched. I stammered something incoherent. He must have sensed my panic because he reached back for the knife. My entire body tensed. He lunged forward, blade slashing the air. I jerked to the side, the knife grazing my shirt. I didn't think. I just reacted. I swung the wrench. It caught him on the shoulder and he yelped. I scrambled away, hearing him curse under his breath. I sprinted around the RV toward the dusty path that led into the open desert. My plan was to circle back, maybe lose him among the cacti, and then double around to find help. He chased me, footsteps crunching on gravel. I ducked behind a tall clump of prickly pears. My breath rasped in my throat. I spotted a figure sprawled by a rock about 20 feet away. It was the old woman. She wasn't moving. There was a dark stain on her side, her face turned to the sky. My stomach heaved. Then Colt was on me. He wrestled me to the ground, pressing his forearm against my neck.
I shoved back, legs kicking in the dust. The blade swept in front of my eyes. My vision blurred. By pure luck I twisted sideways, grabbed a fistful of sand and hurled it at his face. He cursed and rolled off. I didn't waste a second. I dashed back to my RV, jumped inside and slammed the door. He pounded on the side, shouting something unintelligible. My hands fumbled on the key, but the engine wouldn't start. I smacked the steering wheel, certain I was done for. Colt shattered the side window with the butt of his knife. Glass flew and his arm snaked inside, swiping at me. I ducked, grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher from under the seat and slammed it against his forearm. He howled, dropped the knife. I reached across the cab, grabbed the blade and threw it onto the floorboard. He kept banging on the door, screaming. My head felt like it was about to burst. I glanced at the knife at my feet. Without thinking, I scooped it up, shoved open the door and slashed in his direction. He jumped back. I took my chance, leaped out and tackled him. He fought like a cornered animal, thrashing and scratching. In the chaos, he grabbed my wrist, trying to wrest the knife away. My grip loosened. The blade flew out of my hand and skidded across the dirt. I managed to land a punch on his jaw. He went limp, groaning. That was all the opening I needed. I scurried to the driver's seat and turned the key again. The engine coughed, sputtered, but then roared to life, thanks to whatever Colt had done under the hood. He must have fixed it enough to run. The RV lurched forward. In the mirror, I saw him stand, face streaked with dirt and blood, but he didn't chase me. I drove until I reached the main road and found a tiny gas station. I burst inside and told the clerk to call the authorities. The cops showed up, sirens cutting through the haze. I led them back to the campground. They found Colt stumbling around, too injured to run. They arrested him on the spot. It's been a few years since that morning, and I still dream about it sometimes. The desert heat, the tension in Colt's eyes, and the quiet finality of that older couple's RV. I think about how I almost didn't escape, but I'm alive to tell the tale. That's enough for now.
Story 7. My name is Warren Delgado, and this happened back in 2010 in Billings, Montana, while I was driving around in my old RV looking for a change of scenery. I'd saved up for that trip ever since I turned 25, stacking shelves in a grocery store while dreaming of an open road and a quiet place to write poetry of all things. I'm not good at it, but it gives me peace. I'd always heard Montana had sweeping views and big skies, so I pointed my motorhome north and never looked back. I arrived in Billings at dusk, feeling proud of myself for making decent time. The sky stretched out, amber fading into violet, and the air felt crisp against my face. The local RV park was easy to miss. No big sign or fancy entrance, just a narrow gravel road between a line of cottonwoods. I navigated the bumps carefully, windows rattling in protest. I passed a few other rigs scattered across the open lot. Some folks had metal fire rings going. The smell of wood smoke reminded me of childhood summers, roasting hot dogs in my aunt's backyard. There was comfort in that smell, but there was also a strange hush that evening, like everyone had turned in early. I got out to stretch my legs, giving a polite nod to an older couple nearby, but they barely glanced up. They seemed anxious or maybe just tired from the drive. I set up camp, fed myself a lukewarm can of chili, and settled into my seat with a notebook in my lap, hoping for some inspiration. Over the next few days, I planned to explore local hiking trails and maybe drop by the Yellowstone River. I'd heard you could fish there without too much fuss, but first I wanted a shower. The little bathhouse near the main office was a rickety single-stall structure with a dripping faucet. I walked there under a moon that wasn't very bright. When I reached the dimly lit building, I noticed muddy footprints. They led inside, crossed around the sink, and vanished. It struck me as odd, but I just shrugged it off as normal camper business. Inside, the bulb overhead flickered, and the space smelled of stale water. I turned on the shower, stepped in, and tried to wash off road dust. The water was lukewarm at best. In the quiet, though, I thought I heard something near the door. A soft shuffle, then silence. When I looked around the curtain, the door stood half open. Nobody was in sight. I joked to myself that Billings folks must be shy about knocking. The next morning, I decided to drive downtown for supplies. Billings is bigger than some people expect, with modern malls next to old-school diners. I stopped at a small grocery for bananas, bread, and a giant bottle of root beer. Outside, I saw a young guy near a dusty sedan. His hair was shaved close on one side. The other side left long, so it flopped over one eye. He wore ripped jeans and an oversized jacket that looked a couple sizes too big. He waved at me, then came close enough that I could smell stale cigarette smoke. "Hey man," he said, "you staying at the RV park off the main road?" "Yeah," I replied. "Why?" He glanced around like he was checking if anyone was listening. I'd watch my back there. Some folks say weird stuff's been happening. A few travelers ran into trouble recently. He winced as if deciding how much to share. If I were you, I'd keep my doors locked. The conversation set me on edge. But I also had a sense he might be messing with me for a few bucks, or trying to hustle me into paying for information. I said thanks, bought him a soda and headed back. I tried to shake off the strange vibe, but it lingered. I promised myself I'd be careful. That evening, I parked under the same stand of cottonwoods. The older couple was gone, or at least their RV was. Maybe they moved to a different spot. I decided to take a walk around the perimeter to clear my thoughts. As I passed a small camper near a half-dead pine, I noticed the door stood wide open. I peered in, calling out, "Anybody home?" No answer. The inside was a mess, scattered clothes and toppled chairs. It looked ransacked. My pulse kicked up. I wished I could pretend it was none of my business, but curiosity got the better of me. I found the RV park manager near the entrance, an older man in a flannel jacket. He seemed jumpy when I mentioned the abandoned camper. He insisted the owners probably left in a hurry. "Happens sometimes," he said, scuffing his boot on the gravel. Maybe they had an emergency back home, but there was something about his eyes that felt off, like he was holding back. I tried to press him, but he just waved me off and retreated into the office. I spent the night in my vehicle, doors locked, window shades drawn. Sometime past midnight, I heard movement outside. It was faint but deliberate, like someone circling the RV. My heart thumped. I lay there, hardly breathing. After a minute, everything went quiet. I wondered if I had imagined it, but I couldn't make myself fall back asleep. I wanted to leave then and there, but fear kept me frozen. Maybe in the morning I'd feel better. Daybreak arrived with cold sunlight that made the dewy grass shimmer. I told myself to drive out and never look back. Then I realized the older couple's rig was indeed gone and the small camper remained open and empty. A line of footprints marked the muddy ground leading away from that trailer heading east. I hesitated, then followed them for a few yards before they vanished among some tire tracks. A scrap of torn fabric hung off a low tree branch. It looked like part of a shirt, maybe flannel, with a dark stain. I got back in my motorhome thinking I'd stop at the nearest ranger station or police station. That's when I saw movement in the corner of my side mirror. A tall figure stood near the bathrooms wearing black cargo pants and a plain white t-shirt. He was thin, almost lanky, with arms that looked too long for his body. He stared at me. His face was sunburned and his hair was shaved close. In his hand he held something I couldn't quite identify. Could have been a folded-up newspaper or a rag. I didn't care. I turned the key, hoping to get on the road and find help. I barely pulled onto the gravel when he ran up next to me and slammed his hand on my window. His nails were dirty, like he'd been clawing through the mud. I heard him shout, "You picked the wrong place, friend." Instinct took over. I floored it. He pounded on the side of my RV as I lurched forward. Gravel spat out behind me. My tires screeched, and I felt a jolt as if something heavy struck the back corner. I made it onto the main road, heart hammering. Then I saw him in the rearview mirror. He was chasing after me on foot, screaming. I kept going, adrenaline driving my every move. I thought I'd find a gas station or a diner to call the police, but the next sign said the nearest real stop was 10 miles away. On an empty stretch of road, I slowed just enough to make sure I wasn't dragging something under the RV. That's when I heard a metallic clang from the rear door. I looked in my side mirror again and saw the same man clinging to my ladder, staring right at me through the back window. His mouth was twisted into a wild grin. In that moment, I understood the shape in his hand, a wicked-looking hunting knife. I swerved left, then right, trying to shake him off. He was holding on, arms straining. I could see his sweat on the window trickling down as he clung there. I slammed the brakes. The RV lurched. He lost his grip and dropped out of sight with a heavy thud. Fear churned in my stomach. I grabbed my phone, planning to call 911, but I had no signal. The nearest cell tower must have been too far. There was a thump on the passenger side. I realized he was back on his feet, yanking at the side door, trying to force it open. My mind raced. I had a small tire iron under my seat. I fumbled for it. My door was locked, but it felt like only a matter of time before he found a way in. I could hear his voice, muffled but furious. He said something about nobody leaves me behind, though I couldn't catch all of it. Desperate, I threw the RV into gear again. The tires spun and we lurched forward. I heard him shout in pain, then he vanished from view. I gave the pedal all I had. After 100 yards, I braked and stepped out, tire iron in hand, half expecting him to tackle me. Then I saw him sprawled on the asphalt. His shirt was torn, skin scraped raw where he must have been dragged. He wasn't moving. About 10 feet behind him lay another body, crumpled beside a battered sedan that I hadn't noticed before. It was the older man from the RV office, face pale, eyes open, chest stained red. I realized with sudden horror that this lanky attacker had probably killed him moments before chasing me. I staggered back. My stomach turned. A passing pickup finally appeared on the horizon. I waved it down, shaking from head to toe. The driver was a local rancher who immediately called the authorities. Within minutes, sirens pierced the morning air. They found more evidence in that battered sedan. Clothes, IDs from missing campers, and a trunk smeared with something that made the officers grimace.
I spent the next hour sitting on the road's shoulder, answering questions through chattering teeth. Police told me the man had attacked multiple travelers. As for me, I was lucky. When it was over, I drove away, too numb to really process anything. I never wrote any poetry that day, but I did learn that fear can light a fire in your belly you never knew existed. Now, whenever I think about Billings, I remember an open road, a desperate sprint for safety, and the cold shock of realizing how suddenly a life can end.
Story 7. My name is Howard Fletcher, and this happened to me back in 2012 at Devil's Lake State Park in Wisconsin. I'm a former middle school math teacher, and I'd saved up for years to buy a beaten-up RV so I could finally tour the country at my own pace. I'm not some mountain man or wilderness expert, just a guy who gets a kick out of waking up to a fresh view each morning. Early that spring, I packed a small cooler of soda, tossed a few of my mother's knitted blankets in the back, and decided I'd see how far my old rig would carry me before I had to head home. Devil's Lake was my first stop. I remember rolling in that late afternoon. The sky was pale and the wind had a little bite to it. My knees were stiff from driving. I found a decent campsite near the water, though the place was quieter than I expected. There were maybe 3 other RVs spread out across the grounds, each a good 100 yards apart. I could see 2 older women to my left chatting near their campfire, and a father with his teenage son across the loop, fiddling with a fishing rod. I liked the hush of the scene. It felt like a warm welcome after hours on the road. After I parked, I stepped out and stretched. The first thing I noticed was the lake surface reflecting a scattering of clouds. A flock of geese skimmed the far shore. I set up my little folding chair, feeling a surge of excitement. Finally, I was here. No screaming kids in a classroom, no chalk dust in my hair, just me and nature's quiet. As I pulled out some jerky for dinner, I spotted a figure about 50 yards away, drifting between tree trunks. At first I thought it might be a fellow camper searching for firewood. The sunlight was fading, and I only caught glimpses of a tall man wearing a dark jacket, moving with a slight limp. He kept glancing my way, and there was something in his posture that made me uneasy. Maybe it was nothing, but the hair on my arms prickled, and I felt silly for tensing up over a stranger who hadn't even spoken to me. I tried to shake it off. I found myself whistling an old show tune as if I could drown out the odd vibe. I opened a soda, toasted the evening sky, and reminded myself I'd come here to relax. The other campers eventually ducked into their own vehicles or tents. Darkness thickened around the campground. My little lantern cast a warm circle of light that felt both cozy and isolating. Before crawling into bed, I strolled to the public restrooms. The wind carried a quiet rustling from the underbrush. I could make out the silhouettes of oak trees, a few boulders leaning toward the road. My footsteps sounded too loud. About halfway there, I noticed something near the tree line. A flash of movement again. That same tall figure. He stepped away from the trunk he'd been leaning against. This time I heard him call out, but the wind whipped his words away. I froze. He took a step forward and I managed a quick evening before continuing on. He offered no greeting back, only stared. I've never been a tough guy, but I tried to keep a cool head. Maybe he was just shy, or had trouble speaking. Still, I hurried into the restroom. I felt a strange relief the moment I locked the stall. Then I laughed at myself for feeling safer in a tiny tiled box. A minute later, I headed back to the RV. I tried to look casual, but my steps were fast. By the time I slipped inside and locked the door, my pulse hammered. I didn't see him again that night. I fell asleep telling myself I'd probably overreacted. Next morning, I discovered the father and son had left early. The older women were nowhere to be seen either. Maybe their trips were quick, but it felt odd. I brewed some coffee on my tiny stove and ate a stale muffin, planning to hike one of the lake trails. The park's main footpath was fairly empty. I passed a man in a baseball cap who nodded politely, then kept walking in the opposite direction. The trail wound along the lake shore, rising through patches of pine. Something smelled sweet, like blooming flowers, but there was also a faint metallic tang in the air. I tried ignoring it until I saw a shape slumped by a large boulder. It was the man in the baseball cap. At first I thought he was just resting, but then I saw the blood. His cap had fallen off, revealing a gash on the side of his head. I stumbled forward, heart pounding, and realized he wasn't breathing. A raw panic surged through me. I looked around frantic. Nobody else was there. I stepped closer, hands shaking. That's when I saw the footprints in the mud leading away, fresh and deep. I wanted to call for help, but the signal on my phone was spotty. My mind spun. I thought about running back to the campground to find a ranger station. But as I turned, I heard a rustle in the brush. There he was, the tall man with a limp, watching me from behind a tree. Up close I saw greasy hair plastered to his forehead, a jacket torn at the shoulder, and a smudge of dirt or blood across his jawline. I took a step back and he advanced. My voice cracked when I yelled, "We need help. This man's hurt." He didn't answer. I noticed he held something metallic in his hand. It glinted in a stray beam of sunlight. Adrenaline took over. I bolted past the boulder, nearly tripped over a root and sprinted downhill. I heard his footsteps behind me, heavy and uneven, but definitely in pursuit. My lungs burned. I slid down an embankment that cut a sharp path to the lake's edge. Without thinking, I made a dash along the water, kicking up gravel. I wasn't sure where I was headed, but any direction felt better than facing that man alone. Halfway back to the campground, I nearly collapsed behind a fallen log. My breath was ragged and sweat dripped into my eyes. That's when I spotted fresh drag marks in the dirt leading to a patch of thick undergrowth. A second later, I saw a boot sticking out from behind the shrubs. A cold wave of dread washed over me. I approached and found another body, one of the older women I'd seen the day before. Her hiking jacket was streaked with mud. Her face was pale. No question she was gone. I swallowed back a wave of nausea. This was real, and I was in the middle of it. I needed the ranger station, or the park office. There should be a map near the parking area, not too far from the campsite. I forced myself to keep moving. Each snapped twig made me flinch. I was sure he could hear me. My legs felt like rubber, but I refused to stop. When I finally saw the line of RVs and parked cars, I almost cried with relief. I heard an engine rumble nearby, then spotted an official-looking truck. I ran toward it, waving my arms, shouting. A park ranger climbed out, eyes wide. He asked what happened. I tried to explain in broken sentences, but before we could even process it, the tall man emerged from the trees. He moved quickly, ignoring the ranger's order to stop. There was a blur of action I barely understood. The ranger reached for his radio, trying to call for backup, but the man lunged at him with that metallic object, a large hunting knife. I shouted for help, fumbled for a rock, anything to defend myself. The ranger managed to dodge, but he stumbled on uneven ground, falling onto his back. The knife slashed the air. I threw the rock, catching the attacker in the ribs. It must have stunned him just enough for the ranger to pull out his sidearm. He fired, catching the attacker in the shoulder. The tall man staggered, dropping the blade. Blood seeped through his jacket. He glared at us, rage twisting his features. For a moment he tried to move forward, but his knees buckled. The ranger stayed on guard, weapon trained on him. Another shot rung out. When the man reached for the knife again, he collapsed, face pressed into the dirt, his breath going silent. The next hours felt like a fever dream. Police arrived with an ambulance. They checked me over, asked 1,000 questions. They cordoned off the area around the bodies. I watched them carry the tall man away, under a blood-stained sheet. He was gone. Campers emerged from their vehicles, drawn by the chaos, stepping carefully around the taped-off scenes. My RV never looked so comforting as it did then, though I knew the memory of what happened would forever taint that place. I stayed long enough to give a statement. By evening I found myself standing in line at a nearby motel, desperate for a normal shower and a locked door. I don't know why or how this man chose those victims, or what final snap in his mind led him down that path. Maybe he'd been lurking around for days, hidden in the foliage, waiting for opportunities. The police had their theories, but none of them brought back the people who died. It's been 3 years, and I'm not sure I'll ever set foot in Devil's Lake again. I still have the RV. It's been parked in my driveway for a while now, growing dusty. Sometimes I think about selling it and forgetting that trip ever happened. Maybe one day I'll do that. Or maybe I'll drive out again, somewhere a lot busier with brighter lights. For now I'm just taking it day by day. I'm still shaken, but I'm breathing, and I guess that counts for something. Story 8. My name is Grant Kirby, and this happened back in 2012 on Mackinac Island in Michigan, while I was driving through the Midwest in my old RV. I used to work as a part-time librarian in Boston, but I've got a restless spirit. After saving enough money, I decided to take a year off and tour wherever my wheels could manage. My rig was a clunky cream-colored monster from the late 80s that always smelled like stale coffee. Still, I loved the freedom it gave me. One morning in August, I hopped on the ferry to Mackinac with my RV and a few days' worth of groceries, determined to enjoy the island's slower pace before heading west. I had never been to Mackinac before, but people told me it was scenic, with no cars allowed aside from emergency vehicles. The quaint architecture and horse-drawn carriages drew me in right away. After disembarking, I found a small lot that permitted overnight RV parking. It wasn't exactly scenic, just a narrow patch of gravel near some trees, but it felt cozy enough. I set up a couple of folding chairs outside, brewed myself a fresh cup of coffee on the portable stove, and settled in to watch the occasional bike rider pass by. A middle-aged couple, Susan and Jim, parked their RV next to mine the following day. They were friendly folks from Cleveland on their own adventure. We swapped travel stories and found out we all loved roadside diners and cheesy souvenirs. Susan gave me a small decorative spoon she had picked up on a previous trip, joking that I should start a collection. I laughed, promising I'd use it for stirring sugar in my morning brew. It was that afternoon that I first noticed an odd figure. He stood at the far edge of the parking lot, leaning against a tall oak tree. He wore a battered baseball cap pulled low over his brow and a heavy denim jacket even though it was scorching out. His jeans were tattered, and he had this rigid stance like someone who'd been standing still for hours. I thought maybe he was just waiting for someone or trying to cool off in the shade, so I shrugged it off. He never approached us and he disappeared into the woods when evening came. Susan teased me saying I should write a detective novel about mysterious denim jacket men in quiet places. I laughed it off, but something about his eyes, how I felt like he was calculating every move from a distance, made me uneasy. Normally I'm not jumpy, but that night I locked the RV door and double-checked my windows before going to bed. The next morning I walked over to the local bakery for some donuts. The place smelled of fresh dough and sugar. While I was selecting a glazed twist, I overheard a woman whispering to the cashier about a local rumor. Something about a drifter who'd shown up and started doing odd jobs but who had a short fuse. I glanced their way, feeling my pulse quicken, but they hushed up when they noticed me. I paid for my donuts and hustled back to my RV. When I returned to the parking lot, I saw Jim out front pacing. He looked pale and anxious. He said Susan had gone for a quick bike ride and hadn't come back, which was unusual since she'd only planned to circle the block. He asked if I'd help him look. We split up. He'd checked the shops near Main Street and I'd walked down the quiet paths by the shore. As I walked, I kept noticing that same figure in the denim jacket. Always at the corner of my eye. Always far enough away that if I shouted, he'd vanish before anyone else saw him. I told myself not to panic. Mackinac is a friendly island. Still, I wished I had a better plan than just wandering around. I decided to head deeper into the wooded area beyond the parking lot, even though it wasn't part of the usual tourist spots. I saw broken branches and disturbed foliage like someone had pushed through recently. My gut twisted, but I kept going, telling myself Susan might have taken a wrong turn. The sunlight filtered through the canopy and the ground was soft with layers of leaves. I heard distant birds, the clop of hooves on the main road, and then nothing else, just the rustling of leaves in the breeze. About 100 yards in, I spotted Susan's bike. It was on its side, wheels bent like it had been stomped on. My stomach churned. She wasn't anywhere near it, but I found a trail of footprints leading farther in. I followed, stepping as quietly as I could. My heart thudded against my ribcage, but I forced myself forward. That's when I saw him. The man in denim stood near a cluster of towering pine trees, and he was dragging something. My mind froze until I realized it was Susan's body. She wasn't moving and there was blood along her back and arms. I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from yelling. The man dropped her near a fallen log, crouching with one knee down as if he was checking for signs of life. My palms were sweaty, and I inched behind a thick trunk. I hoped he hadn't noticed me. Then without warning he pulled out a hunting knife from inside his jacket. My head pounded. I saw him place the blade to Susan's throat. Her eyes fluttered open just barely, like she was on the brink of consciousness. The man pressed down and she went still. My mind screamed at me to do something, but fear pinned me. This was no mugging. He was calm, like this was routine. After a few seconds he stood up, wiped the blade on his pant leg and grabbed Susan's ankles as if to move her deeper into the woods. I must have gasped. He stopped and glanced around, scanning the trees. I ducked low, but it was too late. He spun and sprinted toward me, mouth set in a tight line. I broke into a run, stumbling over roots and rocks, branches scratching my face. My heart hammered with each stride. I heard him crashing through the undergrowth behind me, gaining ground with every step. "Hey!" Jim's voice echoed from somewhere ahead. I burst into a small clearing and nearly collided with him. Before I could speak, the man lunged from the trees, brandishing that blood-stained knife. Jim tried to tackle him, but he was knocked to the dirt. The blade came down, slicing Jim's shoulder. He screamed in pain, clutching the wound as dark red stained his shirt. Something snapped inside me. Maybe it was anger, or maybe it was pure adrenaline, but I grabbed a fallen branch and swung it at the man's torso. He grunted and staggered back, giving me enough time to help Jim up. We scrambled away, half running, half limping, heading for the path we'd come from. I yelled for help, over and over, my voice cracking. We burst out of the woods onto a small lane by the edge of the parking lot. A couple of cyclists stopped, alarmed at the sight of Jim's bleeding shoulder. I yelled for someone to call the police. The man in denim appeared at the tree line, knife in hand, chest heaving. For a moment I thought he might charge at all of us, but the sight of new witnesses seemed to rattle him. He took a step back, spun around and vanished among the trees. We got Jim to the nearest medical station on the island. The local police arrived soon after. They took our statements, then organized a search party to comb the woods. I told them about Susan. The officer who found her said she'd been killed. Jim was devastated. He kept muttering that he should have gone with her on the bike ride that morning. I had no words to comfort him. They never found the man that day, but they discovered signs of someone living rough on the fringes of the island, an abandoned camp, scraps of food, a tarp. Locals speculated he might have hopped on a night ferry or stolen a small boat to reach the mainland. I spent the next few hours filing reports, describing his face, his jacket, the horrifying moment in the trees. Then the officers told me I should consider moving on. They'd stay on alert,
but Mackinac Island was still a small place, and folks were spooked. That evening I packed up my RV and said a quiet goodbye to Jim. He looked hollow, clutching Susan's spoon with trembling hands. I gave him a shaky hug, unsure if I'd ever see him again. The ferry ride back to the mainland felt endless. My shoulders ached with tension, and every little noise made me jump. I drove until I couldn't keep my eyes open, then pulled into a well-lit rest stop. My own reflection in the rearview mirror startled me. I looked older, like I'd aged a decade in one day. I locked all the doors, closed the curtains, and tried to do, though every small bump in the night jolted me awake. There's not much more to say. I still remember Susan's warm smile when she handed me that silly little spoon. I think about Jim's haunted eyes as he watched me leave. I wonder if he managed to find any peace, or if the island ever located the man responsible for everything. Even now, the thought of returning there fills me with dread. I keep Susan's spoon in the RV's glove compartment, a reminder of how fast things can change. Sometimes I catch myself staring at it, wishing there was a way to rewrite that day. But there isn't, and I've made my peace with that fact. It's all part of the road I chose, and that's all I've got left now, just a broken memory and a spoon that stirs my coffee on lonely mornings.
Story 9. My name is Walter Gray, and this happened to me back in 2006 in Dahlonega, Georgia, while I was out exploring in my battered old RV and thinking I finally had the time to stretch my legs after quitting my office job that never let me use my vacation days. I was never the bravest guy, and I admit I get jumpy even when a branch scrapes my windshield at night. But I'd always loved the freedom of the open road, so when I left that job I thought I'd drive around the southeast to clear my head and maybe discover something better. My rig was a 1988 model with peeling paint, but it had a bed, a tiny kitchen, and enough space for my fishing gear. The plan was simple: find a quiet spot by the river, enjoy a few lazy days, and not worry about a soul. That first afternoon in Dahlonega, I steered down a winding road that cut through thick pines and rolling hills. The sky looked a bit cloudy, but I couldn't resist the idea of stopping by the Chattahoochee National Forest. I'd never been much of a hiker, but I had a little collapsible chair and my fishing rod, so I figured I'd cast a line somewhere scenic. As I pulled onto a narrow dirt path, I passed a small white sign, half rusted, that indicated there was a campsite about half a mile deeper in. The site itself was nearly empty. I saw one other RV parked under a big oak and an old sedan missing its hubcaps. I hopped out of my vehicle, stretched, and hollered a friendly hello at the older gentleman leaning against his camper. He nodded back but didn't say much. I sensed he preferred his own company, so I decided not to bother him. Then I noticed a young couple by the sedan, looking like they were deciding whether to set up a tent or keep driving. It was quiet, and that suited me fine. I spent the evening fiddling with dinner, canned chili, heated in a little pot, and watched the sun go down beyond the hills. Everything felt calm until I heard this clatter of metal behind the trees. It wasn't an animal. It sounded like a shovel dropping onto rocks, sharp and deliberate. I leaned out my RV door, peered through the gathering dusk, but saw only the silhouettes of tall pines. I figured maybe someone was setting up a fire pit. Next morning I wandered off to a nearby trail with my fishing pole strapped over my shoulder. The day was cool, and the forest floor was damp from the night's drizzle. My boots sank an inch into the mud, but I kept going until I found a decent creek. A sign read, "No fishing without permit," so I decided not to push my luck. I ended up just sitting on a mossy log, letting the quiet seep in. At one point I heard voices upstream, two men talking in low, fast tones. I couldn't make out the words, but I caught the name Derek repeated maybe 3 or 4 times. Then one voice snapped, "Keep your mouth shut," before they fell silent. Something about the tension in that sentence made me pack up and head back to the RV. I'm not the type who rushes into trouble. I prefer to let folks handle their own business, so I tried not to dwell on it. But when I got back to my campsite, I noticed that old gentleman's RV was gone. The sedan was still there, but the couple was missing too. I assumed they went hiking, so I just shrugged and opened a bag of peanuts for a quick snack. Late afternoon, I decided to drive further down the forest road, looking for a better place to spend the night. As I navigated the ruts and bumps, I glimpsed something bright red through a gap in the trees, a piece of clothing maybe. It looked like it had been tossed into the brush. I braked and hopped out to investigate. It was a t-shirt torn along the front and stained with a brownish blotch. I remember feeling a tight knot in my stomach. I forced myself to pick it up and saw the pattern of a popular band's logo. Definitely blood. Dried but fresh enough to give me a jolt of dread. I scanned the area and spotted footprints leading deeper into the woods. I followed them for a minute but started to lose the trail when the ground turned rocky. That's when I smelled something foul. At first I told myself it was just a dead deer or some rancid trash, but the stench was too strong, like old meat left out in the sun. My heart beat faster. I took a few cautious steps around a bush and found the older gentleman's body. He lay twisted on his side, eyes open, throat cut. I froze. My arms went numb and I nearly dropped the t-shirt. I backed away, my breath coming in short bursts. I didn't see anyone else, so I sprinted back to the RV. It felt like my mind was on fire trying to process what I'd just witnessed. I fumbled for my phone, saw there was no signal, and realized how isolated I truly was. Part of me wanted to drive away as fast as possible, but that man's face was stuck in my head, and I also remembered the young couple. I'd never forgive myself if I left them in danger. I decided to head toward the main road, find a place with reception, and call the police. But just as I started the engine, I heard a truck roar behind me. A battered pickup barreled around the corner, blocking the path. A tall man with a shaved head and a scowl jumped out. He wore a dark green jacket with a strange patch on the sleeve, some kind of homemade emblem. I saw another figure in the passenger seat, but I couldn't make out his face through the tinted glass. The tall man stomped to my window, yanked the door handle, and stared at me. His face was gaunt, eyes sunken, with a scar across his left cheek. He rapped on the window, demanding I step out. My heart pounded so loud I thought he could hear it, but I forced a smile and cracked the window just enough to talk. "Get out," he barked. His voice was icy. I gripped the steering wheel. "What's going on?" He looked at me like he wanted to rip the door off. "You seen anything you shouldn't?" I thought of that poor man's body. My eyes flicked to the spot where I knew it was hidden behind the bushes. The tall man caught that glance and raised his eyebrows. A mocking grin spread on his face. I pushed the gas pedal, hoping to jerk around him, but he shoved a metal bar straight through my half-open window. It smashed against the steering column and glass sprayed across my seat. Panicking, I threw the door open as hard as I could. It hit him in the shoulder and he stumbled back. I dove out, rolled on the ground, and ended up inches from his heavy boots. He swung that bar at my head, but I ducked and crawled under the RV, scraping my elbows on rocks. The passenger door of the pickup opened and I heard quick footsteps. Another man with thick stubble and a baseball cap kicked at my legs. I scrambled out the other side, fumbled into the driver's seat, and tried to slam the door shut. The tall man blocked it with his foot. I jammed the keys in the ignition, twisted them so hard I thought they might snap, and heard the engine catch. In the side mirror, I saw the stubbled man run behind me, rummaging in the bed of their truck. I knew I had only seconds. With the door half open, I slammed on the gas. The tall man jumped aside, cursing me. The RV screeched onto the main path, bouncing over potholes, swerving as I wrestled the wheel. My breath felt ragged, but I kept going. I heard a bang behind me, maybe a gunshot. I wasn't sure. My rear window shattered. I stomped the pedal, feeling the RV shudder with the strain. I skidded onto the paved road, then floored it, tears streaming down my face. The forest whipped by in a blur. My mind raced with questions. Who were they? Did they kill that old man over something trivial? Where was the couple? Were they alive? A few miles later, I found a small convenience store. I lurched into the parking lot, jumped out, and ran inside. The clerk saw my battered face and probably thought I was out of my mind, but he let me use the phone. The local sheriff's office said they'd send a deputy right away. I paced near the coffee machine, eyes darting at every car that passed, certain the tall man and his friend would find me. The deputies arrived in minutes. They took my statement and told me to stay put. I asked them about the young couple, whether they'd heard anything. They just told me to stay calm. Eventually, they found the older gentleman's RV near the body and they confirmed he'd been murdered. I never saw that couple again, and I don't know if they got away or if something worse happened. The sheriff thanked me for my information, but also warned me that the men were still at large. I ended up following the patrol car back into Dahlonega, where I spent the night in a cheap motel with a broken lock on the window. I barely slept, replaying every moment in my head. I wondered if I should have tried to help that older gentleman sooner, or if the couple had met the same end. I left Georgia the next morning. Even now, I'm uneasy behind the wheel of my RV. I see a stranger scowling by a gas pump, and I feel a shiver of old fear remembering that tall man and the dead look in his eyes. But I'm still here to talk about it. That's all I've got left. Story 10. My name is Theo Blevins, and this happened to me back in 2010 near the Painted Desert in Arizona when I decided to take my old RV on a trip because I needed to clear my mind after quitting my job at the auto parts store. I remember how the heat felt that afternoon, dry and sharp, pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. I'd been winding along narrow desert roads, the sky wide and bare, searching for a pull-off where I could park for the night. The Painted Desert spread across the horizon in layered bands of rust, pink and ochre. I'd read somewhere that ancient people found it spiritual, and I hoped that those silent rock formations would grant me a little peace of mind. Truth is, I'd just gone through a nasty breakup. My fiancé left me for some lead guitarist in a bar band, and I needed a fresh start. My buddy tried cheering me up by loaning me his father's ancient fishing poles, but I'm not much of an angler. Still, I loaded them in the RV next to a cooler of root beer and set off, telling myself there had to be something better out there than feeling sorry for myself. That first evening, I found a secluded spot on a gravel spur off the main road. The vantage point was incredible. I unrolled a folding chair, cracked a cold bottle of root beer, and stared at the desert. The horizon looked endless, and for a moment my troubles felt small. After dinner, some slightly burnt hot dogs over the tiny propane stove, I stretched out on a blanket by the RV. The sky turned from bright blue to orange, then cooled into the darkest night I'd ever witnessed, sprinkled with countless stars. I breathed easier than I had in months. That sense of freedom in wide-open land makes you feel like anything is possible. Early next morning, I heard the rumble of another vehicle. It was a battered pickup truck creeping along until it stopped about 100 yards from my spot. A tall man with a red bandana around his neck hopped out. He had this wiry, lean build, and his eyes seemed half hidden beneath a frayed straw hat. He glanced my way, gave a nod, then clapped the side of the truck before disappearing down a narrow trail between some scrubby bushes. I didn't think much of it. The desert draws all sorts of folks, photographers, hikers, weirdos seeking cosmic vibes, you name it. I figured he might be on some private mission to find the best vantage for sunrise. By noon, the sun blazed overhead and I felt restless. I decided to drive a little deeper into the back country, see if I could spot any wildlife or interesting rock formations. Something about the painted desert calls you forward, like an old friend who can't wait to show you everything. I hopped in my RV and navigated the rough roads as best I could, trying not to blow a tire on jagged rocks. The heat shimmered, making the horizon quiver. I felt alone yet not lonely. That's when I spotted a van parked half hidden behind a giant boulder. I slowed to get a closer look. It looked old and rusted, tinted windows cracked in places. I thought maybe the driver was in trouble. In this kind of desert, one breakdown can mean a nightmarish situation. I pulled to the side and approached on foot, hollering, "Hello, everything okay over there?" My voice sounded too loud in the stillness. Nobody answered. The driver's door was ajar, and there was a dark streak on the dusty paint that made my stomach clench. I stepped closer, ears ringing. Inside, I saw a mess of blankets and tangled cords. A strong metallic smell lingered. That's when I caught sight of a shape slumped in the passenger seat. I forced myself to lean in. Part of me already knew what I'd find. There was a person in there, motionless. His face was pale, eyes half open. A red stain spread across his chest, dried into his shirt. I felt every nerve in my body go tense. My hands shook. I whispered a few words I'd rather not repeat, fumbling from my phone. No signal. The heat, the stench, and the shock made me dizzy. I realized I needed to find help, but out here help wasn't exactly around the corner. I hurried back to my RV, locked the doors, and turned the key. My heart pounded so loud I could hardly think. I decided the nearest ranger station was probably my best bet. They sometimes keep an eye on these remote areas. As I swung the RV back onto the dusty track, something moved in my rearview mirror. That tall man with the red bandana stood behind a distant ridge watching. My blood felt like it had turned to ice, but I just drove. My mind raced. Should I confront him? Flag him down? But something about his stance made my instincts scream to get away. So I pressed the gas, unsure if I was acting brave or cowardly. The roads twisted through ravines of layered rock. My tires kicked up clouds of dust, and every so often I glanced back to see if the man was following. I saw nothing, just that desert glare and the swirling wind. After about 20 minutes of tense driving, I spotted a sign that said Painted Desert Trailhead, and I knew there might be a small parking lot or a map kiosk, maybe a phone. I pulled in, relieved to see another vehicle, a dusty SUV with a faded license plate. The relief lasted until I noticed the SUV's windows were smashed. My gut churned with dread. I inched closer, then saw an older couple inside, slumped over the front seats. Their bodies looked twisted like they'd struggled. I was too late. The entire scene felt unreal. I didn't know whether to vomit, cry, or scream. Before I could decide, I heard a noise behind me. The tall man was there, that bandana wet with sweat, hat casting a shadow over eyes that seemed to stare right through me. He had a rifle cradled against his hip. I froze. He didn't say a word, just raised the barrel an inch, gesturing for me to step back from the SUV. I stepped back slowly, hands raised to show I wasn't a threat. My voice was shaky as I asked him what he wanted. He just crooked his finger, telling me to move around toward the rear of the SUV. I obeyed. The desert sun felt scorching. I could hardly breathe. Then I glanced at him, and for a split second I saw something in his expression. Something cold, methodical. He wasn't robbing me. This was different. Before he could bark another silent order, I made a decision. I turned and sprinted. He fired, the shot exploding in the stillness. I ducked behind a boulder. My heart hammered so hard I almost choked on my own breath. I had nothing to defend myself with except a small pocket knife in the RV. Another shot ricocheted off the rocks. He was determined. I had to get to my vehicle, but it stood in the open about 50 yards away. I peered around the rock, saw him inching closer, rifle up. My palms slick with sweat, I yanked a stone from the ground and tossed it far in the opposite direction.
As he glanced toward the noise, I scrambled behind another rock, trying to zigzag closer to my RV. He fired again. A chunk of rock chipped away near my head. Dust stung my eyes. I coughed, felt tears welling up from pure adrenaline and fear. Inch by inch I edged toward the RV. The man cursed under his breath. My legs cramped, but I kept moving until I reached the side of the vehicle. I yanked the door open, throwing myself inside. Another bullet lodged in the metal. I jammed the key into the ignition, turned it, and the engine coughed into life. A quick glance at the mirror showed him rushing forward, eyes locked on me. The rifle barrel was up again. As I floored the accelerator, the bullet shattered my side mirror. Glass rained onto the driver's seat. I gripped the wheel, knuckles white, and roared out of the lot, desert dust trailing behind me. My heart hammered so wildly I felt like passing out. But I kept the pedal down, swallowing air in frantic gulps. The RV rattled and pitched, but it held together, and soon the lot was a blur of desert behind me. I drove for what felt like hours, praying for the first sign of civilization. Eventually I reached a lonely gas station with battered pumps. I lurched to a stop and ran inside, words tumbling out of me so fast the cashier couldn't make sense of them. I forced myself to breathe, to calmly say people were dead, that a rifle-wielding man was behind it, that we needed the police. The cashier grabbed a phone and dialed 911. Minutes later I heard sirens in the distance. It felt unreal, but I clung to the relief. The sheriff's deputy arrived first, a calm, steady figure in a tan uniform. I spilled the details, leading him and a small team back toward the painted desert. They asked me to stay in the cruiser while they investigated. I waited for what felt like an eternity, listening to distant radios crackle. Eventually they returned, grim-faced. They found bodies. They found the abandoned pickup. The murderer was gone. I answered questions for hours. They took statements, tested my hands for gunshot residue, made sure my story matched the evidence. I told them everything. The slumped man in the van, the older couple in the SUV, the shots fired. They believed me, or at least they seemed to. By sundown, they let me go, telling me they'd be in touch if more info surfaced. I crawled back into the RV, heart still pounding. I managed to drive to a proper campground, parked among a few other travelers, and finally shut off the engine. I sat in silence. My legs felt weak, my mind still spinning with the images of what I'd seen. When the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt a strange relief just to see other people around. The next morning, I headed straight out of Arizona, driving until my back ached. It was hard to reconcile the beauty of the desert with the horrors hidden out there. Sometimes I wonder what drives a person to become so vicious, but I guess that's a mystery only he can answer. I'm safe now, but I'll never shake that memory.